Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all here again this morning. I hope you enjoyed yesterday as much as we did. We had an amazing group of speakers, and we were all just kind of buzzing afterwards and this morning talking about all the different kinds of insights and the progression of this whole water data community over the years. And it's incredible, way more than I was expecting, to be quite honest, of a feeling of accomplishment collectively, and just, a sense of honor to be part of this community. So I hope you're all well rested and ready for another day. We have a full day of events. Although the symposium ends in the early afternoon, we have right afterwards, after a short break, we have a workshop diving into the Delta data Tableau ecosystem that was just discussed and introduced yesterday morning. So hopefully you can stick around for that. If not, enjoy this morning and the session that goes into like the early afternoon. And we are also here to honor some of the work that's been done and traditional ecological knowledge that has been provided over the years. So we have a really exciting day. So looking forward to all the speakers and all the participation from all of you. So thank you. We're going to review some of the logistics here. So this is being recorded as we've discussed before. It's also being streamed over on a YouTube channel that will provide the link, or the link has been provided. We ask that you use the Q&A function to ask questions of the panelists. If you have technical questions, we ask that you email Anna at her email address there. This worked pretty well yesterday. We did get a few people that raised their hands. We can't really respond to raised hands. We can't empower people to speak. So you have to basically type in your question into the Q&A interface. That's how we're going to do it. So I want to thank the panelists who got here this morning to help us get ready. We are, I think, ready to go and have a really great discussion. So first, though, I would like to welcome a special guest. We have a surprise here. So I would like to welcome a special guest who will introduce himself, and go ahead and advance, please. And Allie, I'm not hearing any sound.
We might have to reshare with sound. The suspense is getting to us.
It's a lot. It just makes the surprise even more surprising.
I recognize it.
Perfect, that works. Thank you. I'm gonna go on mute.
Good morning. Just wanted to say I'm honored to be here today to be part of this conference that's going on. My name is Brian Tripp. I'm a member of the Kaduk Tribe of California. I recognize and identify as Kaduk Ada. Kaduk in my language means upriver, and Ada means person. So I look at myself as Kaduk Ada. We named ourselves after the river. That's how important it is to us. It brought all of the fish and all the things that live in it and all the things that depend on it. And one of those things is my people. We live in the middle stretch of the Klamath. The Yuroks are below us, and then the Klamath tribes up above. And right now our river's so polluted. Right now it's being continued to be every year. It gets lower and lower, and the pollution becomes worse and worse. They talk about taking dams down, but they don't. We need something done. And then people are trying to take it even more and taking it south. Something has to stop someplace, and I'm hoping it's not my tribe. So I'm glad to be here today. And the poem that I'm going to read, well, the song is actually a song. We believe in power of song, power of prayer. And my poem is it's called In the Spawning Ground. So I hope you listen and take it to heart. Thank you. Hayad, hayad, hey, hey, hayad, 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 hey, hayad, 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 I am from the spawning ground. It's the one that we all know. At one time or another, we all swam from the same hole. That's when my water broke. That's when my father spoke. He said, when I was young, I was told, know how the water tastes, know which way it flows, feel the wind, know which way it blows, learn from the animals, the birds and the bees, say a prayer for the home ground, the rivers, the rocks, the mountains, the ocean and trees. Always give more than you take. Always work hard for the people's sakes. Don't tell lies. Do things right. Sing your own song, and you won't be wrong. So, what I know is what I owe. Take it, use it, then put it back in the ground where it was before it was found. And then give it water, let it flow. Give it light and make it bright and let it glow. With love, with respect. That way, that day, we all can grow. Yotwa, Yotwa, Yotwa.
I want to thank Brooke Thompson for her help in organizing and arranging the video. I watched it a lot of times, but I wasn't as affected as I was this morning. So I'm going to hand it over to Allie, who's going to help introduce the next session, and I will share my screen, and I'll be back with you guys. And so thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Greg. I have a similar reaction. I tried watching the video yesterday so that I wouldn't be emotional today, but here we are. That was beautiful. And I really can't think of a better way to kick off this next session. Let me get hang on, sorry guys. Greg, are you sharing? You're up? Okay. This next session is really about kind of the interconnectivity of things. And as in Brian's song and prayer, I think it really touched on that, you know, and I'm like thinking, man, the water boards, maybe we should change our mission statement to match that song. It really hit hard. So this next session is the California chapter of Society for Freshwater Sciences. My name's Allie Dunn. I guess I should introduce myself. I oversee the surface water ambient monitoring program throughout the state. We've got several monitoring programs. The one most related to this session is our bioassessment monitoring program, where we look at what's living and what's alive in the streams, right? And what better way to tell the health and condition of our freshwater ecosystems than what's alive and living there. Yesterday, you heard from the board chair talking about the work that we do. And, he highlighted that macroinvertebrates and algae matter, right? So this panel today, the session is going to talk about freshwater science, and these are early career scientists. Angela de Palma-Dow will get into the details of that, so I won't talk much more other than to say I'm super honored and excited to introduce this session and hear from this incredible crew of early career freshwater scientists. And with that, Angela, are you on?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hi, yes, loud and clear.
And you can see me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Allie. So
Sure.
I did request remote control. There we go. Okay. All right, so thank you so much. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the California chapter of the Society for Freshwater Science. And then we have a special session that's showcasing some of our Cal SFS fellows. So we're really trying to showcase the future of freshwater through this chapter and through our society today. And I want to acknowledge I'm the chair president of the chapter, and then also our treasurer secretary, John Olson, as well here. And you can follow us on Twitter at Cal SFS Social. I think the little box might be covering up the Twitter handle for me, but go ahead and you can move that and go ahead and follow us on Twitter. So again, I want to thank so much the Water Data Source Science Symposium today for allowing us to have an entire special session this morning to showcase our fellows. And then we really want to thank the Society Freshwater Science Long Range Planning Committee for supporting these fellows. So they provided basically the fellowship funds for us to be able to have this fellowship program. And that's the Long Range Planning Committee through the Society Freshwater Science. So if you're unfamiliar, the Society for Freshwater Science is an international scientific organization, and the purpose is to promote further understanding freshwater ecosystems, such as rivers, streams, lakes, reservoirs, and estuaries, and ecosystems at the interface between aquatic and terrestrial habitats. And so specifically, SFS, or Society for Freshwater Science, promotes and fosters the exchange of the scientific information among the membership, as well as promotion with this engagement among other professional societies, as well as resource managers, policymakers, educators, and of course, the public. And we really feel like the mission of the society and the purpose of the Data Water Symposium align very closely. Basically, the society started in 1953. Right now, we have over 1,800 members, and it is an international organization. So these memberships span across the globe. And basically, the defining feature of SFS is the investment and commitment the society makes to interdisciplinary, international, interinstitutional exchange and mentorship, particularly among young scientists. And that's what really makes SFS a leader in integrative aquatic science. Particularly for the California chapter, we're really trying to uphold these the mission for SFS within our own state and the surrounding region. So we really have this focus on aquatic research, application, and policy for all and by all in California ecosystems, ecotones, bioregions. And so this is a really great opportunity for the chapter here today for the symposium to be able to share that mission and expand upon it. And a little thing about, or some tidbits about the chapter is we are the only state-specific chapter of SFS. We do have annual meetings that coincide with the California Aquatic Bioassessment Work Group. So we have one coming up in October that'll advertise later. And we do have an annual winter newsletter every year that kind of covers what we've accomplished, what our plans are, and then kind of, shares what our students are doing and what other members of the chapter and the society are doing. And then we had only 33 members in 2020. COVID hit us pretty hard. So we are looking to get our membership back up. I think at the most we had 180. And we really want to expand this membership and encourage, if you're interested in freshwater, if you're a student, if you're an early career scientist, or if you, have been in the field for a while and you have mentorship desires and capabilities, we encourage you to become a member in our chapter. And then these are some of the SFS core values, and these have been identified in the Society's 5-year strategic plan. And so as a regional chapter, we really are trying to promote and meet each of these core values, particularly supporting, developing freshwater scientists, as well as advancing diversity, inclusivity, and equity in freshwater science. And to do this, we started this fellowship program this year. And so this is our our guinea pig cohort. You guys are awesome for being the trial for this. And basically the fellows, they serve for a year. They present at the annual SFS meeting. They participate in our Cal SFS meeting. And then this is like a bonus. So they're presenting here today too at the Water Data Science Symposium as well. And then they are awarded a stipend for being fellows. And we wanted to make sure that that stipend fit their needs, what they needed. So it's beyond just travel funds. They could use it for research equipment. They can use it for help publishing. They can use it for travel if they want, or anything else. We wanted to have this flexibility support there for the fellows, so they can accomplish what they want during their fellowship. And then we can encourage them to continue being members in Cal SFS and SFS for the betterment and future of freshwater. Some other things we did as part of the fellowship is to waive registrations. And then we also have some mentorship and networking opportunities. So if you're working for the state and you are thinking about, sharing some information, you can be a mentorship, please reach out to Anna Holder. We are working to connect our fellows with some agency state personnel to try to, encourage the cross interaction, interdisciplinary nature of this program. And again, it's a trial year, so I might present next year on what we learned and talk about our next cohort of fellows. And so these are the fellows. I'm so excited. They're going to be here over the next hour or so to talk about some of their topics. So we have Kyle Leathers. This is from left to right. Robin Lopez, Alyssa Obester, William Oda, and Melissa von Meyerhauser. And I'm just so excited for you guys are here. You can follow us on Twitter, learn more about their research. And they're going to be talking about things like what's a natural river, Southern California urban rivers, ecological racism, seeking equity and justice, thermal vulnerability in Sierra Nevada streams, functional flows in the Eel River watershed, and Santa Ana River working extremely disturbed system. So it's a broad scope of research that both these students and early career scientists are covering today. And I'm just so thankful and excited that they're able to share their research and what they're doing and what they're going to be doing here at the Water Data Symposium today. And so again, thank you so much for having us. And if you are interested in joining the chapter, you can email us at cal.chap.sfs@gmail.com. You can also reach out to us via Twitter. We have some communication ambassadors that would love to talk with you and be able to, get you hooked up with being a member. And then we'll go right into the next session. Thank you so much, Ali, for moderating this today. And again, thank you to the symposium for allowing us to have this special session. And good luck to all the fellows. I'm really excited to learn about what you guys are doing.
Awesome. Thank you, Angela. And we can, if folks have questions for Angela, she's going to close the session out as well. So feel free to hold on to those questions and shoot away at the very end. So with that, I'm going to transition to our next speaker, Melissa von Meyerhauser. Sorry, totally botched that. Meyerhauser, where she's going to talk about, what is a natural river and how we can understand ecological opportunities and cultural values as flows decrease in Southern California urban rivers. Melissa, are you on?
I'm here. Good morning.
Okay, great. Good morning.
Thank you, Ali. Yes, my name is Melissa von Meyerhauser, and I'm a freshwater ecology PhD student at UC Berkeley and a proud Cal SFS fellow as well. Thank you to Angela and John from Cal SFS and the Water Data Science Symposium for the chance to speak this morning. I'm really excited to be here. And I'd like to ask you this question that is often on my mind, which is, what is a natural river? And I think about this a lot because I work in a lot of highly modified urban rivers, two of which I'm going to tell you a bit about today. I'm going to be talking with you about some of my research ideas as I finish up the first year of my PhD, so I'm still at the beginning. And yes, I'm seeking to understand these ecological opportunities and cultural values as flows decrease in Southern California urban rivers. Okay, so I'd like to, let's see. Here we go. I'd like to begin by introducing two of my wonderful study rivers to you, not with their names yet, but with these satellite images. And the river on the left is often called one of the last remaining natural rivers in Southern California, since it remains largely ecologically intact. whereas the river on the right is often no longer called a river, but instead a flood control channel in some cases, due to this legacy of channelization where a lot of the river was encased in concrete. But these rivers really have a lot in common. They both have Mediterranean climate flow regimes, so really flashy hydrologies going from low to high flows, sometimes very quickly. They're both located in a global biodiversity hotspot, and they also share a watershed border. So they're sort of sister rivers. These are the Santa Clara and Los Angeles rivers, and they are part of the ancestral and unceded watersheds of the Chumash, Kizh, Tataviam, and Tongva people. And these rivers have always held and continue to hold great importance to these tribes, and I'm really honored to be a guest in these watersheds as a researcher. And something these rivers have in common as well is that the majority of their flows along their main stems, like the ones you see in these pictures here, have come from treated wastewater discharge, also known as effluent, since the mid to late 20th century. And these effluent discharges have really transformed these rivers' flows from being lower and more variable to being higher and more consistent. And these changes have led to the development of these new types of ecosystems and new social uses. So these river reaches now support this combination of species that are much more adapted to higher, more stable flows, from endangered species like the three-spined stickleback in the Santa Clara to wading birds like the black-necked stilt, and invasive species like the giant cane or arundo here. And these river reaches also support a variety of social uses that wouldn't necessarily exist without these higher flows. In some of these reaches, like fishing and kayaking and appreciation for biodiversity. But the policy landscape is really changing in California. And following California's last extreme drought, the State Water Board implemented its policy, the Water Quality Control Policy here for recycled water, which really encourages wastewater treatment plants to recycle a lot more water rather than discharging as much of it into waterways. And this has led to exciting research like at the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, looking at how these effluent reductions will affect river species and habitats and beneficial uses. And here we are in the California on the right in so much red. Once again, we find ourselves in a state of drought, and extreme and exceptional drought in some cases, which is really increasing a lot of the urgency experienced right now around the need to increase local water supplies, such as through recycling more wastewater. And at the same time, we have a lot of active planning processes happening, especially in the LA River watershed, where we're asking the question that we see from the LA Times in the upper left here: what role should the LA River play in a future Los Angeles? And there's a lot of excitement around this idea of bringing nature back and what that means. And from my experience working, going to a lot of different planning processes during my time working at a nonprofit, LA Waterkeeper in LA, I really have noticed a disconnect in some of these planning processes between the reality that within the next few years, there likely will be this big reduction in flows in the LA River because of the effluent discharge reduction. So there's a disconnect between that reality and a lot of the planning processes that sort of take for granted a lot of the flows existing as they are there now. And in the meantime, a lot of people are being overlooked who depend on these flows for a lot of basic needs, such as we see in this article from the High Country News. So there are a lot of conversations happening now with the LA River around what natural would mean with restoring it. And at the same time with the Santa Clara River, my experience has been it's often sort of taken for granted. It's already natural, it's already the last of its kind. So it doesn't receive the same spotlight, even as a lot of development is encroaching into its riparian areas right now. So in the context of these upcoming reductions in effluent discharges and really varied approaches to revitalization in these urban rivers, I wonder what our goal should be with restoration projects. And one question I ask is, should our goal be to restore rivers to a natural state? And I think this is such an interesting question because from going to a variety of meetings, I've heard very different takes on this. For instance, with the conversations around effluent reduction, a lot of conversations have been, well, that would be more natural because we're returning to a natural flow regime without the unnatural effluent. At the same time, I've heard conversations of how we have to keep a lot of water in the river because people only recognize the river as natural if it has flow. And without effluent, a lot of segments or reaches of the river will run dry. So that's all to say there are a lot of different perceptions and metrics that we could use. And I think as I launch into my research, it's really critical to think through this question and ask a lot of people what they think, especially from management agencies, from tribes and nonprofits representing people from across Los Angeles, because I certainly do not have the answer to this question, but I'm quite intrigued. So as I'm thinking about this, I wanted to tell you about some of the different types of methods and data I'm starting to use as I think about this question of what a natural river is and how changes in river flows affect people and ecosystems. And I think we need a variety of approaches. So these range from analyzing remote sensing and gauge data to monitoring aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates, to analyzing community collected bird data, and also conducting a human perception survey. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about these different approaches. And I think it's really important to understand how flows in vegetation have changed over time so that we can prepare better policy now. And I'm thinking about this in terms of compiling flow gauge data, wastewater treatment plant discharge data, looking at monitoring efforts that are already happening, such as from the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition, and integrating these efforts with remote sensing data. I'm also thinking about how to bring in historical and local knowledge that spans well beyond the timeframes of remote sensing and gauging tools to be able to answer some of these questions. I'm also building on the rich history of aquatic invertebrate monitoring that's been carried out by the Stormwater Monitoring Coalition, and I'm monitoring aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates upstream and downstream of effluent discharge points. So here, for instance, is the Santa Clara River, and these two pictures are only steps away from each other, but you can see quite a difference in the ecosystems between the place where effluent is discharged versus upstream. And I think it's especially important that we integrate terrestrial invertebrates into our monitoring of these stream segments, because with the likelihood that more and more of these reaches will run dry in the future, the terrestrial invertebrates are becoming more and more important indicators of dry stream health. And finally, I'm really interested in how people interact with rivers and are experiencing these changes in flows. And so I'm starting to analyze data from the community-driven applications iNaturalist and eBird, looking at how people's observations of birds along rivers change over time as flow levels change. And I'm also planning to carry out a survey in the future, thinking through some of the questions I've been asking of you today. And so here's an example of something I'm interested in that maybe you'd want to ask yourself as we look at these pictures of which river segment pictured here is more natural. And of course, I don't have an answer, and I'll leave that as a rhetorical question for you. And just speaking of flows, it was great to participate in the annual Society for Freshwater Science conference this year and co-moderate a panel with my advisor, Dr. Ruhi, and postdoc in my lab, Dr. Colombano, about scaling the effects of flows across time and space and biological organization. So I appreciated the chance to speak with researchers from across the world on some of these questions, and I hope we can continue these efforts. And I wanted to close by really thanking the California chapter for the Society for Freshwater Science, as well as my department at UC Berkeley, Environmental Science Policy and Management Department, partners at SCWRP, the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project. And I'd like to sort of offer a special thanks to Drs. Ruhi, Grantham, and Mazur for all of your support. And finally, here's my contact information at the bottom. And if there's anything that has stood out to you where you're interested in speaking further, share some thoughts, think about collaboration, or maybe you just want to have a philosophical debate about the meaning of natural rivers, then please feel free to reach out. And thank you so much again for this opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And I think you really hit it on the head that our freshwater systems are so complex and so complicated from one system to the next. I think you're sitting in the LA River in your background, and I'm at the McLeod, and look at the stark differences between those two, and each have their challenges. So thank you so much for your work on this. I'm going to turn it over to see if we have any questions for Melissa. I think we have time for at least one question.
We do. Do you think that the state and local governments should discourage urbanization in the Central Valley and other areas with little to no water?
Okay, so again, do I think that governments should discourage? Could you say that one more time? River.
If you think they should discourage urbanization in the Central Valley and other areas with little to no water?
That's an interesting question. Because urbanization could mean so many different things. And I think that certainly the availability of water and clean water is an important factor to consider. And there are many ways of approaching urbanization, I suppose. And there's a lot of, there are different approaches, like there's urban sprawl compared to really trying to build sort of these centers of urban life that'll have lower environmental impacts, for instance, and be more efficient. So it's difficult to answer that question, not knowing more about the context, but I'd be curious to hear more of your thoughts.
Understood. And we have one more. How do you think we could use terrestrial insects to understand stream health?
Yes, thank you, Kyle, for that question. I think that as we think about the ecological importance of our dry stream beds, we can sort of start to monitor terrestrial invertebrates so that we can think about them as indicators of the health of these sections. Because if there's no water, we can't monitor aquatic invertebrates, of course. And so, but we still need a way of measuring the health of these sections. So there's a lot of exciting science that's happening now around sort of developing indices and indicators around terrestrial insects when a lot of the energy has been devoted to aquatic invertebrates previously. And so there are a variety of methods we can use. And so I think it's a growing and exciting part of aquatic or freshwater ecology and thinking about including terrestrial insects.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Melissa. And then, so next we have up Robin Lopez. Robin will be talking about ecological racism and seeking equity and justice via social and cultural competency. So super excited to hear from you, Robin. This is kind of a newer topic that we've all been really interested in, newer as in presenting via a conference. So take it over, happy to hear from you.
Thank you. Let me make sure I got the remote control set. There we go. Everyone, yes, my presentation, Ecological Racism, Seeking Equity and Justice via Social and Cultural Competency. My name is Robin D. Lopez, pronouns are he, him, and this is presented in collaboration with one of my PhD advisors, Ted Gransom, out of UC Berkeley, and another collaborator named Matt Cover out of CSU Stanislaus. Before I jump into anything, I do want to acknowledge and actually take a few moments of acknowledgement. This first moment of acknowledgement is to the Cal SSF Fellowship Program. It's allowed me to attend my first annual SSF meeting, as well It's allowed me to present as the primary author on work intersecting freshwater and social dimensions. It also enabled me to interact and engage with many new peers who have similar interests in the areas of environmental justice and ecological integrity. And in a way, I was able to develop a sense of belonging within this specific space at the FFF meeting. As I'll be entirely honest, when I typically go to conferences, I do not feel a sense of belonging. I do not feel like these spaces are crafted for my voices or the voices of my community to be taken seriously. And so I am appreciative that I'm able to be here today to speak on an issue that is very near and dear to my heart, but more than just an issue that I think warrants attention. It's an issue that for many of us is renders itself into a life or death situation. So I hope as you all hear what I have to share, you hear with an open heart and an open mind. I understand there may be some hesitancy due to vulnerabilities, but I do ask that you please take a moment. In terms of further acknowledgement, I do want to give formal land acknowledgement before we move forward. I'd like to take the moment to recognize the space I currently occupy as Ohlone land, Richmond, California. And I also like to recognize the indigenous knowledge that has afforded us the privileges of using such environment, such as my home communities of Oakland, Richmond. And I challenge all of us to think critically about how we can decolonize such spaces and decolonize ways of thinking. And also this intersect into this issues of continuous racial and social injustice. And I believe this is a good segue into talking about ecological racism. In a time of deep reckoning with racial and social injustices, it's imperative we leverage our positionality to truly catalyze change. As rising researchers, educators, scientists, and several in here policymakers, we're not immune to the trauma of this world, nor are we exempt from engaging in the necessary and uncomfortable dialogue. The work we do in academia and science has direct and indirect impact in upholding systemic and institutional barriers. And if you're not familiar of this image of this young boy, this is Adam Toledo, who was recently slaughtered by the police in Chicago. And when I made this presentation, this was before I was recently harassed and racially profiled by the police a couple weeks ago. And so I'm not sharing this to take digs at police, but I'm sharing this to also highlight that something as simple as wanting to interact with the green space or with our natural water system is not as simple as it is for people of color like myself. We can't just venture off into some of these green spaces and feel safe without having to be profiled or having to be stopped by folks who say we look like we don't belong there. And my final moment of acknowledgement to my mentors and advisors, folks like Ted Grantham, Matt Cover, whom are the co-authors of this presentation, that move as accomplices, not just allies, for the growth and development of historically marginalized identities, as well as my co-advisor, Paulo Diodorico at UC Berkeley, another individual who listens with sincerity and seeks to make a more just and equitable space in our Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley. And I guess before I move forward with anything else, I guess I would assume it's appropriate to also give brief background on myself. As you heard previously, out of Oakland, was raised in Richmond, California, two communities that have been hyper-villainized and hyper-criminalized in the lens of the media as very violent spaces. And that is not how I've ever seen it. I've seen both those communities as places of love, places of growth, and places of comfort. But with that said, due to the way we are perceived and how we are treated, that had led to severe underfunding and under-resourced allocations for our educational system. And as a result, I barely graduated high school. And I also come from an indirectly system impacted background. And with those two issues combined, I was not at all prepared for college. I had actually dropped out several times trying to navigate my way. And it wasn't until age of 21 when I switched my hustle after several traumatic events friend being murdered, incarcerated, and best friend unfortunately dying by suicide, that I decided to go back to school and try to find something that's a bit different. And today I stand before you at the Hood Ecologist. I'm a researcher at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, where I've been since 2012. And as you're probably already aware, PhD candidate at UC Berkeley in the freshwater and ecohydrology lab group. I would say that's it in terms of talking about myself for background. And this is where I really want to get into the nitty gritty, particularly that representation matters. Statistically, I'm not supposed to be here, and few scholars navigate these spaces safely that rise from similar historically marginalized environment. Anecdotally, interactions and perceptions of nature are very different for me, as I previously alluded to, and folks like us are not afforded equitable access, exposure, and resources to actualize respective potential, especially in the field of freshwater ecology. And so methods of scientific outreach are severely inadequate. There are well-intentioned efforts that can be acknowledged, but most programming all seems like shallow efforts of diversity. And our communities are drowning in these shallow waters of outreach. That critical information and exposure is locked heavily within the ivory tower of academia through various forms of gatekeeping. And along these shallow waters, though, are deep roots, literal and figurative roots that interconnect with the subsurface, vast mysterious connections waiting to be explored and explained. And that dives into this idea of habitat restoration and ecosystem protection, particularly around water. We talk about this often, but seldom does academia interact with original land stewards, native and indigenous knowledge, who did an amazing job in maintaining and protecting ecosystems for thousands of years and continue to do it to this day and continually are overlooked by academia. And so I think about the ecological integrity of my own research in Northern California and the Russian River watershed, fish survival and migration in response to climate change, drought, and groundwater influence, Northern Alaska's Arctic ecosystem when I'm analyzing frozen soil to contextualize the impact of climate change, our stream restoration nationally, assessing where restoration is prioritized and what level of investment is provided. Spoiler alert, it's not equitable, but are we surprised? And so that goes into this idea of ecological racism. And I'm sure you all are just dying to learn and find out what is ecological racism. You've heard environmental justice, you've heard of environmental racism. And so now you're wondering, what is this dude coming through talking about ecological racism? Well, I'm here to wake you up. Ecological racism refers to ecosystems largely occupied and utilized by historically minoritized and marginalized identities that are exploited, extracted, are restored without regard to impacted communities. Consequently, these critical identities and voices are missing from the spaces of environmental science. Therefore, there is a need for addressing issues of ecological racism via social and cultural competency. And so now you know. So now what? Just as freshwater ecology recognizes that biological and functional diversity underpins ecological integrity, sustained meaningful effort to advance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion have the potential to bring integrity to our research community. And before I move on to the next slide, I'll say, given that I only have 12 to 15 minutes to go into this, don't take this as everything that you need to know. Google it. You have access to so much information. And so all that said, in my own study side, I do think of myself as that coho salmon, trying to survive, and people want to help, but don't fully understand the problems needed to be solved. And I think of that out-migration process that we talk about often, a small fish in a vast ocean moving with the waters. We know that the fish is somewhere out there, but we don't know what it's doing to survive. We only know that if it survives, it finds its way back home. And that's an ecological story that I resonate with very deeply. And I share that to say, let's not wait to see if integral pieces of our ecosystem survive or not. Let's not wait to see if individuals like me survive academia or not, because there's so many more in not just my community, but similar communities that are trying to get access to that exposure, that are trying to bring their best whole self and their creative inquiry into these spaces, but they get gatekept by credentialized scientists or gatekept because of whatever respective identity that they may have that is marginalized in the system. So let's invest in the people in the community. Let's not extract. And so I'll close this out with some methods for addressing ecological racism. This is not a full-on comprehensive list, but maybe this will give you the tool set to start thinking critically about what needs to be done. And so it needs to be handled with intent and care. It needs to hold space and acknowledge the nuances and complexity of different experiences. It needs to ensure it's never complacent because the work never ends. It needs layers of accountability, and it needs participation from everyone. It needs more than just representation. It needs robust support financially, emotionally, and professionally. And it needs asset-based framework because deficit model framework is not the business and requires mutual aid, vulnerability, and advocacy. And so I'll close that out. Thank you very much for your time. If you're social on Instagram or Twitter, you can find me at Hood Ecologist.
Thank you so much, Robin. We appreciate you coming here today, and hopefully it's not, I know this was only 10, 15 minutes that we got to talk, but I hope it's the beginning of an ongoing conversation and engagement with you over the next several years, hopefully. I want to turn it over to Peter to see if there's any questions for Robin.
We do, and I also want to thank you, Robin, for bringing your voice and your message to us. It was really powerful. Thank you. The question I have is based on your science, based on your experience, how can scientific societies and agencies reach out and make the pathway to aquatic science and application more obtainable, more available, and more accessible to those who traditionally have been underserved and or overlooked?
I would say that requires very region specific or location specific outreach. Again, because marginalized communities or minoritized communities, our identities, we do not operate as a monolith. We all have different needs, and that's where that social and cultural relevance comes into play. Understanding how a particular community takes in the knowledge transfer process, because it does vary from region or even neighborhood to neighborhood. And I would say one of the first things is don't assume that peer-reviewed published research is the way that people are going to have access to that knowledge. General public is not going around reading peer-reviewed articles. We need to find ways to make it more interactive, getting creative, and maybe making creative content that highlights our work while putting faces and imagery of people that look like folks from those communities. That way there's a sense of connection.
Great. I have another question. What would help integrate social and ecological and technical, I'm sorry, let me start over. What would help integrate social, ecological, and technical science better?
I think one of the best ways to answer that is allowing folks for their truth to be heard and their truth to be recognized and acted upon. To me, quite honestly, that's what it really comes down to. We often talk about having that representation or having folk come into the table to talk, but we often don't give those same folk the opportunity to have power at the decision-making table. There's still a system of imbalance. And so when we get closer to that, I think we also get closer to integrating those three components and having something that's truly intersectional, that is truly representative of our society and really raises the bar for ecological integrity as a whole.
Thank you. I have another question. Powerful and wonderful talk, Robin. Can you talk about accessibility for marginalized communities in traditional college pathways versus online education courses and boot camps, things like that?
So I'll be honest, I don't have too much, I don't feel like I have too much insight on that. What I can say is that into my own experience in the traditional college pathway, it helps a lot when you see professors that look like you or counselors that look like you, fellow students that look like you, who have those shared experiences and that collective experience to move forward with these studies and understand social and cultural relevance of whatever we're learning. And that context of online learning, that's not something I necessarily have experience in or have dove too much into, but I will say there is deep value to it because there are folks who do not feel comfortable entering those physical spaces of systemic oppression and institutional barriers. And that's something we need to acknowledge and recognize, that some folks flourish much better from distance learning or online-based learning. Perhaps a silver lining to this pandemic and why we're in this virtual conference, folks are able to engage the educational process in a way that's comfortable for them, without having any of their anxieties or trauma triggered in a physical space.
Thank you so much. I look forward to hearing more from you. That's all the questions we have.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Robin, and thanks, Peter. Okay, so moving on to our next topic, we're going to hear from Kyle Leathers and thermal vulnerability in Sierra Nevada streams and looking at spatial scales and drivers. Kyle, turning it over to you. You there, Kyle?
It's not saying I can change my video or start it.
There you are. Hi.
Okay.
Hi.
All right. Now I should be good.
Okay, cool.
Let's see if I can get this to go. Great. Okay. I'm excited to share my results with everyone today on the spatial scales and drivers of thermal vulnerability in Sierra Nevada streams. And to start off, I'm a Cal SFS fellow. I'm really excited to be a part of this special session, and I was lucky to present results from the first chapter of my PhD on how early low flows into Sierra Nevada, the result of climate change, can affect aquatic food webs, including both emergent insects and also terrestrial consumers like Brewer's blackbirds that were able to wade in streams at low flows and feed on aquatic insects, which they couldn't do during high flows. It's been great to see different state agencies and the work that they've done for this conference, and I'm excited to get to know more people for the rest of the time as a fellow. To jump into today's topic though, climate change threatens Sierra Nevada streams, starting with increases in air temperature, which are predicted to be 2 to 6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. This increase in air temperature will lead to higher snowmelt rates, and it could result in snowmelt, which currently melts off in August and results in low flow in most of our streams in the Sierra, occurring up to 2 months earlier in June, which would lead to a much longer period of low flow. And this is concerning to water temperature and thermal vulnerability because low flows can reduce thermal buffering. They can increase the residence time as the water takes a longer amount of time to travel downstream. It has a longer amount of time to heat up as well before it reaches the same point. And it can result in increased overlap between minimum flow and maximum air temperature. Currently, max air temperature occurs during the summer, around July or early August, while minimum flows occur during the fall for the most part. However, with climate change, not only would maximum air temperatures increase, but they would also occur almost at the same time as low flows during the summer, which would increase vulnerability. Despite knowing how all of these factors might change thermal vulnerability and impact water temperature, there's still some questions we have to figure out. These include when thermal vulnerability will occur temporally, where it will occur spatially, and why some areas might be vulnerable more so than others, which are the environmental drivers. These are combined into my central research question for this talk: what is the thermal vulnerability of Sierra Nevada streams? This can be broken down into temporally, does air temperature affect water temperature during the summer, which is the critical time we have to consider, as that will be the time of max water temperature and air temperature potentially, and the thermal maxima that organisms might reach that could threaten them. We also need to understand spatially at what spatial scale is a stream vulnerable or resilient to climate warming. It could be that the entire watershed responds the same way to climate warming, and it's all either vulnerable or resilient. However, there could also be differences between pools and riffles. Maybe pools are more resilient because they have a higher amount of water that cools them down and increases their thermal buffering. Or there could even be microhabitat variation where each individual pool or riffle has its own unique characteristics that might affect their thermal vulnerability going forward. And then lastly, what drives water temperature, and do these drivers predict resilient or vulnerable watersheds going forward? To answer all these questions, I deployed 52 water temperature sensors in Bull Creek, which is about 20 miles west of Kings Canyon National Park and close to Shaver Lake. And this is also within the Kings River Experimental Watershed, led by the U.S. Forest Service and Pacific Research Station. And they have 3 long-term monitoring sites there for flow and temperature, including a main stem site, B200, a small headwater, B201, and an intermediate site, B203. In addition to these sites, I deployed sensors in 10 50 to 100 meter reaches, which varied from the main stem of Bull Creek to intermediate sized segments of the stream to headwaters, which were mostly at higher elevations. And the sensors at each of these were measuring water temperature at a 15-minute time interval. And within each of these 50 to 100 meter reaches, we had a paired pool riffle design, where there were 3 pool riffles adjacent to one another at each had a water temperature sensor placed within them and an air temperature sensor placed within them to measure thermal sensitivity. And we used time series models to answer these questions for our first 2 sub-questions and a spatial model for the third sub-question, which I'll get to in a second. So the graph isn't showing up super great on my end here. I'm not sure why for this one slide, but it should have been showing that air and water temperature are highly correlated throughout most of the year, while water temperatures are more moderate during the summer and winter. And this is just kind of background information, which I can share at a later time if you would like. And then for the actual results, for the temporal vulnerability, we used a DLM model, which is a dynamic linear model, which allows us to test how water temperature is affected by air temperature at very short time scales for every 2 days, rather than using a regression relationship that might average the relationship between air temperature and water temperature per month or per season. This allows us to get at a much higher temporal frequency, which is useful for understanding how sensitive it actually is and at what time scale that sensitivity changes. But we can see that throughout the year, air temperature has a positive impact on water temperature. And we can interpret the y-axis as the change in water temperature per change in air temperature. So for most of our long-term sites, that value is very high from late spring to early fall and around 0.3, which means that a 1 degree Celsius increase in air temperature leads to a 0.3 degrees Celsius increase in water temperature throughout this time. And based on this, we can conclude that the summer is highly vulnerable to warming. Moving on to the spatial data, we can look at the average max temperature of each reach, and we can see that some of them are highly warmed with about 20 degrees Celsius max temperature in one headwater, while another headwater had 12 degrees Celsius max water temperature. In addition to this variability, we noticed this big drop in water temperature, which is really interesting. And looking back on when we were going out there was a lot of fire smoke, and looking at some of the light data that we had, we can conclude that this is likely due to wildfire smoke causing a sudden synchronous decline in water temperature. And it'll be interesting to see what the creek fire impacts have on water temperature that's been recorded for the rest of the year when we look at that data. And in answering our spatial scales question, we used a multivariate autoregressive or MAR model to answer this. And we found that the reach scale best explain water temperature variation. And this means that managers should consider the 50 to 100 meter reach of a watershed as what might be vulnerable to warming or resilient to warming for modeling or for conservation efforts. In addition to this, we found that mean and minimum water temperature were improved with the inclusion of air temperature as a covariate to predict water temperature. So both of our first 2 sub-questions support the importance of including air temperature as a covariate for high-frequency water temperature data. Moving on to the third sub-question for the environmental drivers behind this vulnerability, we found that elevation was always important as a driver. As we increased in elevation, water temperature tended to decrease. And this is likely due to both reduced air temperature and increased amounts of snowpack, which will both be affected by climate change going forward, which is a concern. We also found that increases in conductivity led to increased water temperature. And this is likely due to shallow snowmelt that has a very low conductivity, resulting in some headwaters having lower water temperatures for mean and minimum than others, which is also a concern for climate change, given this is one of the main drivers. And lastly, we saw that discharge had a negative effect on water temperature, which makes sense given that reduced thermal buffering in small streams likely leads to a higher susceptibility to warming. But discharge is also likely to increase if we have reduced snowpack and reduced precipitation with climate change. So all of these are reasons for concern. And even though we understand the environmental drivers of water temperature, we need to understand whether this matters more so than what's happening upstream. And to answer that, I used a spatial stream network model, or SSN model. And we found that upstream temperature tends to matter much more in explaining variation in water temperature than what's happening at the local level. So we really need to consider managing for the entire watershed and not just at a local reach scale. And we can observe both the modeled results from the spatial stream network model and also the observed values. And we can see here they agree fairly well, with the observed values being the points with the white halo and the modeled values being shown in the actual watershed itself. And this just demonstrates that as we increase in elevation, there tends to be cooler max temperatures. And our smallest site, H1, a small headwater at low elevation, had peak max water temperatures compared to some of our other main stem sites that were larger. And even though we understand that the Sierra Nevada streams are likely to be vulnerable from answering these three sub-questions, we still need to understand whether it actually matters to the ecosystem. Will the taxa that are there be affected by warming? And to answer that, we can look at the current suitability of habitat now and whether that will change in the future. And here I am graphing the percentage of taxa that are vulnerable at each temperature based on their CD75 value, which is that temperature at which 75% of occurrences of an organism occur at a lower temperature. And if we look at the current distribution of habitat thermally, we can see that the taxa are well suited. The distribution of temperature habitat in Bull Creek based on our best model matches really well with the current thermal preferences for the organisms that live there based on what Dave Herbst has done in collecting samples. However, based on our analysis on our first sub-question of thermal sensitivity and finding that 0.3 value of a 1 degree Celsius increase in air temperature causing a 0.3 degrees Celsius increase in water temperature, and predicted increases in air temperature of 6 degrees Celsius in this region of the Sierra Nevada, in the future, we might see a large mismatch between the availability of habitat and the thermal requirements of organisms to survive. So many of the taxa, especially EPT taxa, mayflies, stoneflies, and trichoptera, might be removed from the system and not be able to survive going forward. So in conclusion, increased air temperature will increase water temperature during the summer, and there is reason to believe that streams will be vulnerable in the Sierra Nevada. The thermal vulnerability tends to vary at the reach scale, which means that we should consider 50 to 100 meter reaches as the area at which water temperature is likely to vary. And we found that elevation, discharge, groundwater, and snowmelt are all important environmental drivers of water temperature and sensitivity, which is concerning given that all of these are associated with climate change and likely to be affected by climate change going forward. And we also saw that upstream temperature mediates thermal vulnerability, which means that we should conserve the entire watershed and not just doing local restoration efforts to manage for water temperatures that are likely to increase in the future. And lastly, taxa are currently well adapted to the thermal distribution of habitat, but warming threatens many and is likely to change the ecosystem in the Sierra Nevada going forward. With that, I'd love to thank all the people who've helped me out with this project and the funding that I've gotten from a couple of different groups, and especially thankful to CalFFS and the Water Symposium for hosting me here. I'm happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyle. It's super interesting work that you have going on. Peter, are there any questions for Kyle?
Yes, we have one question. The observation that thermal sensitivity is time varying was really interesting. Some months are more sensitive than others. How does that match with insect life histories?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of insects are going to vary for when they're going to emerge or what resistance strategies they have if a stream does go dry or if it becomes not well suited for survival. So it'll depend a lot depending on the taxa. And if we looked at the EPT taxa being more vulnerable a couple of slides ago, we could see that some taxa are likely to be more affected than others by vulnerability. And there's especially high vulnerability during early spring for small streams. I think this was due to snowmelt causing a lot of suddenly warmer water traveling over the land, entering the stream and warming it suddenly. But I think that the really critical period will be during the summer in August and July, where a lot of taxa might reach their thermal maxima, or there's the highest chance of them experiencing max temperatures. So some organisms are already well adapted to emerge before that, so they're not going to be exposed to those temperatures, while others that are surviving in the water at that time are likely to be most vulnerable.
Great. Can you use SSN to predict refugia across the network, i.e. what habitats may not ever warm up?
Yeah, so I think for future predictions, there's a case of whether the entire watershed will warm at the same rate or not. And I would say that smaller streams are likely to be more effective than larger ones if they're most likely to go dry. And they also have the most change per reduction in discharge. But we can model changes or predictions for some of the parameters, like for water temperature, we could predict it throughout the watershed. So if we could predict for an organism, its habitat and its abundance throughout the watershed, which we have macroinvertebrate data to do going forward, we're going to try to predict which area is likely to have the lowest abundance of certain species and which ones are likely on the cusp of being vulnerable.
Great. And one more question. If you were developing a long-term monitoring plan for your study watershed to track the warming changes you mentioned, what would you most prioritize in designing this plan?
Yeah, so I think based on the spatial scale question that I had for which spatial scale we should monitor at, we found that it was the reach scale. It's a little redundant to have so many sensors within a 50 to 100 meters. And it's better just to have maybe 1 or 2 sensors in that space to be able to deploy sensors at a larger time scale. And I think it'll be great to see water temperature going forward in Bull Creek, but also to compare it to some other headwaters nearby in the larger Deer Creek watershed near Shaver Lake and the Washone Reservoir. And that'll help us to understand differences between watersheds where some might have more groundwater influence or more snowmelt influence.
Great. Thank you. That's all the questions we have right now.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Kyle. Excellent talk. All right, so moving on to our next speaker, Alyssa. Alyssa's going to be chatting with us about functional flows and how we can use those to establish flow criteria in California's South Fork Eel River watershed. So moving up to the northern part of the state. Alyssa, are you on with us? Okay.
I am. Could you advance to the next slide, please? Thank you. So yes, like Ali said, my name is Alyssa Obister, and I am an environmental scientist at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife within the In-Stream Flow program. And today I'm going to be talking about a project that I've spent a lot of time working on, where we are using functional flows to establish flow criteria in the South Fork Eel River watershed. Next slide. So a little bit of background on flow management to get us started. So in California, as in much of the West, managing flows is challenging, particularly given competing water uses. And traditional methods for determining species flow needs and balancing those needs with other water uses are typically time and resource intensive. And these methods don't always capture the variability in flows that's so important in California's river systems. So due to these challenges, there's this need for the rapid development of environmental flows that are consistent across the state. Next slide. So to address these challenges, the California Environmental Flows Framework was created by a diverse group of partners from state agencies, nonprofits, and academic institutions. And the framework provides guidance and tools for managers to develop flow recommendations at the statewide scale. This also helps managers improve the speed and consistency, as well as the standardization and technical rigor in establishing flow recommendations statewide. Next slide. And the California Environmental Flows Framework, or CEF, uses a functional flows approach for determining flow needs. And this means that it focuses on these components of a river's flow that support critical biological, chemical, and physical functions. And so in this hydrograph that we're looking at, these key aspects or functional flow components are indicated by the colored boxes. And so if we look from left to right, that orange box represents the fall pulse flow. And this is that first major storm event that follows the dry season. And key functions of this event include flushing nutrients downstream, supporting riparian vegetation, and providing cues for aquatic species. Next, in the dark blue rectangle are the peak magnitude flows. And these are those large-scale flow events in the winter that transport sediment, inundate floodplains, restructure the river channel, and maintain habitat diversity. Next are the wet season base flows, and these are defined by that prolonged period of elevated base flow during the winter, like their name suggests. And these flows support migrating and overwintering habitat for native species. Then in the green box are the spring recession flows, and these represent the transition between high and low flows. And these gradually receding flows redistribute sediment deposited by those higher flows earlier in the year, and they also provide important cues for aquatic and riparian species. And then lastly, in the yellow box are the dry season base flows, and this is generally the most sensitive period of the year for native species, during which both the quantity and quality of water limit habitat suitability. Next slide. And functional flow components are quantified or described by functional flow metrics. These are presented in the table on the right here. And these include the magnitude, timing, duration, and rate of change of each one of those flow components, or the boxes on the hydrograph. And so if we look back at the hydrograph, that blue line represents what we might think of as a natural flow regime in a snowmelt system. And the red dashed line represents a functional flow regime, where we see that the functional flow regime hits on those key points of variability throughout the year. And this is a key strength of the functional flows approach, because there's this explicit communication about the importance of variability within the year and across years. And like I mentioned previously, the functional flows approach is a key part of the California Environmental Flows Framework, and the framework and its tools and products are based on this approach. Next slide. So we at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife In-Stream Flow Program, we've been involved in the development of the framework. And a key product of this framework is a set of functional flow metric predictions for every stream reach in California. And so we're using this product to develop flow criteria. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be talking about how we're actually doing that in two different ways. Next slide. And a little bit of background before I dive into that, just on the watershed that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to be presenting on the South Fork Eel. And look, this is located on the north coast of the state. And it was identified as a priority stream by the California Water Action Plan, as it supports this really diverse array of salmonids, including Chinook and coho, as well as some other species of interest, including hardhead, lamprey, and several species of sculpin. There are no major dams on the South Fork Eel River, but there are numerous water diversions related to cannabis. And the in-stream flow program was tasked with identifying in-stream flow needs for this watershed. And so this is an example of a case where we have this large watershed, a lot of species, where we want in-stream flow information over quite a large geographic area. Next slide. And so to get at this information, we've developed what we call a watershed-wide criteria report, which, as the name suggests, it's a rapid approach for developing watershed-wide flow criteria. And these are developed using existing hydrologic and modeling tools like those provided by the California Environmental Flows Framework. And these can be combined with site-specific data when they are available. And so we're preparing a watershed criteria report for the South Fork Eel, and I'm going to dive into what's in that report in the next couple slides. Next slide. So the first step in these reports is to examine the reference hydrologic patterns in the watershed, which we refer to as base hydrology. And doing this helps us get at some context to work with when we're developing flow criteria. So our first analysis is what we call flow variation. And this is where we obtain gauge data for a reference gauge within the watershed. And we look at the variability of flows in the wettest, driest, and median year within the period of record. And we plot these data in a hydrograph like the one on the right here. And this helps us visualize both the inter and intra-annual variability in flows within the watershed. And then looking at the hydrograph, you'll notice that there's also that black line towards the bottom. And this is our second base hydrology analysis. And these show the median monthly natural flows. And these come from the Nature Conservancy's Natural Flows database. And these show the median monthly unimpaired flows within the watershed. And we also use these median natural flows as an input for some of our other analyses. Next slide. So after we gather that background base hydrology information, we then use a functional flows tool from the California Environmental Flows Framework to obtain the estimated functional flow metrics by water year type. So on the slide here, within the table, we're looking just at a subset of those functional flow components. So just for the fall and the wet season base flow. And these are, like I said, presented by water year type, as you can see in the 3 columns. And looking at an individual cell, the first number presented is the median value, or the value of that flow metric in about 50% of years. And then the number in parentheses next to it represents the value of that flow metric in 80% of years. And so if we just focus on one of these components, the wet season base flow, to better understand what these numbers actually mean, if we look at wet year, wet season base flow, you'll notice that in wet years, the base flow magnitude is about 1,000 CFS, but ranges between about 600 and 1,300 CFS in 80% of years. The wet season lasts about 135 days and typically starts around November 16th. And then we also, in our reports, display these metrics in the form of a hydrograph like the one on the right. And this hydrograph in particular represents the functional flow metrics in wet years. Next slide. And so functional flows are a centerpiece of our watershed criteria report, but we also present a couple additional analyses to provide some supplemental information on ecosystem and species-specific flow needs. So our first are the ecosystem-based flows, and these are these monthly flows needed to preserve a healthy stream ecosystem. They are calculated as a % of monthly and annual natural flows using Tessman's adaptation of the Tennant method. These are also used in the Water Board's cannabis policy. And these are presented on the right here on the hydrograph as a black line with those median monthly flows provided for some context. And then in addition to that, we also present salmonid habitat optimum flows. And these are the flows that maximize usable habitat area for salmonids within a given reach. And these are based on a synthesis of PHAB sim equations for the Western US. Next slide. So then we take the results of those, the functional flows and those additional analyses, and we begin the process of developing flow criteria using those functional flows as a starting point. And the functional flows help us answer the question of, what are the flows that are needed to preserve the ecological and physical processes both throughout and across years? And then we use those additional analyses that I was just talking about to understand any specific ecosystem or species-specific flow targets. So for example, we could use an ecosystem-based flow value for the month of January or February as a check and compare it to the wet season base flow value for a given water year type. Next slide. So we take those functional flow metrics and develop flow criteria for a flow regime for a particular location of interest. You'll notice that that final flow regime on the right incorporates all of those functional flow components. And this is for one location within the watershed, but you can imagine that with the tools and the method that we've laid out here, these criteria could be developed for any reach within the watershed. And in this example, you'll notice that all of these results came from either models or existing data sets, but you could imagine that these functional flows could be paired with site-specific data if they were available. Next slide. And so really briefly, this is what we did in Redwood Creek, which is a tributary to the South Fork Eel River. Our program performed an intensive field study in Redwood Creek. It was selected due to its high water demands and potential to provide habitat for a variety of salmonids. Flow criteria were developed using a combination of functional flows and field data, and these were developed for 10 reaches. Next slide. And so these flow criteria were developed through site-specific work that I just mentioned, and were compared with functional flows to ensure that each one of those 5 functional flow components were incorporated into the final flow criteria. So on this plot, those colored boxes represent the range of functional flows in 80% of years, and the black line represents the flow criteria that were developed via the site-specific methods. Next slide. And so each one of those 5 functional flow components were examined to assess how well they represented the field-based flow criteria that were developed. And so then we also incorporated the peaks and pulse flows and the recessions into the field-based criteria so that the final criteria were this hybrid of field-based criteria and functional flows for 3 water year types. Next slide. So to wrap up, the in-stream flow program has found functional flows to be a really helpful and flexible tool for developing in-stream flow criteria, both in the watershed criteria report and in the site-specific study in Redwood Creek. These flows clearly represent the interannual and seasonal variation in flows in a way that other methods don't necessarily do. We incorporate variability from the outset as part of our flow criteria. These can be rapidly developed using these functional flow tools. And as we showed here, they can easily be combined with some of the more traditional field methods to develop a more comprehensive set of criteria for a reach of interest. Next slide. So with that, thank you all for listening, and thank you especially to Cal SFS for this fellowship opportunity and the chance to attend and participate in the annual SFS meeting. And I'm now happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Great, thanks, Alyssa. Peter, do we have any questions for Alyssa?
We do. Tying this great work of CEFF with Melissa's presentation, what other types of watershed or management applications do you foresee this type of analysis being useful for in natural and other systems?
That's a good question. So in this case in particular, because this was part of the water action plan, we're going to be providing these criteria to the board to consider when they're developing their flow objectives and recommendations. But these tools could also be used by those water managers working on the ground to establish flows or prioritize areas for flow restoration.
Okay, and I have another question. Can this be replicated on streams without gauges?
Yes, so those functional flow metric predictions are available for every stream reach in the state, regardless of whether they're gauged or not.
Oh, wow, great. That's all the questions we have right now. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Alyssa. Great talk. All right, so moving on to our next talk, we've got William Oda. Will be chatting with us about the Santa Ana River and opportunities from working in an extremely disturbed system. turning it over to you, William.
Great. Thank you all so much for spending so long and sticking around for my talk and listening to me. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit of data and a little bit of narrative about the Santa Ana River and what I see as opportunities for freshwater ecology moving forward. And I have this quote that is from two of my favorite authors that I constantly am citing, Roy and Walsh: "The growth of new cities and urban renewal in aging cities provides unique opportunities to advance stream ecology." So what am I focused on in the field of freshwater urban ecology? The first are what challenges there are that exist. The first that I focus a lot on are the advanced spatial and temporal disturbance regime that exists within urban areas. The second is novel species, specifically the introduction of either non-native or invasive species, depending on the impact they are having. And the third that I like to focus on is what effect is anthropogenic or human infrastructure having in these areas. And there's this great figure from McKinney in 2002 that looks at how species richness declines as we have increases in impervious surface area. So a lot of my work focuses on the species that are really into this area and will probably be classified as adapters or exploiters. When I'm looking at this and trying to address the challenges that I believe exist within urban ecosystems, I think about a few different mechanisms. The first is the selection and dispersal of primarily native and then novel species within urban habitat. The second are predator-prey or trophic interactions within these habitats and how they're being altered by an urban versus non-urban landscape. And then finally is life history alterations. And this can be both the most informative, but also the most challenging, at least for me, to examine in my current study system, which we're getting to next. So I work in the Santa Ana River, and I think I have a bit of a inflammatory title when I say this is an extremely disturbed river, but I think it's also an accurate way to think about what is going on here. So the section of the Santa Ana that I work on stretches from San Bernardino to Riverside counties. It is bounded by two dams, Seven Oaks Dam on the north end and Prado Dam on the south end. There is a stretch of dry urban river below Seven Oaks Dam before the river is re-wetted by primarily treated wastewater from two facilities, and then supplemented by a variety of other urban wastewater facilities downstream, with a third being the primary source. So there's extremely limited dispersal into and out of this urban river habitat due to dams and also drying of the river. There is quite a lot of channelization and impervious surfaces that have been introduced for a variety of reasons. Wastewater provides a highly altered hydrologic regime from the traditional boom and bust flooding and drying that we see in this sort of very dynamic Southern California Mediterranean watershed. And then lastly, there is a variety of novel community members that have been introduced for recreational purposes or accidentally or as a form of biological pest control. I have a list of our extant and non-native community members that we can reference in the questions if you guys want to ask me about them. But what I focus on right now are a few different species of interest. The first is the Santa Ana sucker, which is a threatened species federally. The second is the arroyo chub, which is a California species of special concern. And the third is a really important predator of these two native species, the largemouth bass. So the rest of my slides are going to focus a lot on the interactions between these three species and how they contribute to the community as a whole. So questions and hypotheses, I've kind of covered these when I talked about mechanisms and other things, but how is the Santa Ana River changing over time? And we would hypothesize that there's a decrease in community diversity over time due to these increased urban alterations, specifically wastewater introduction. And the second question is, how are changes in the community affecting trophic relationships? So that we predict that wastewater and the introduction of novel species are sort of reducing the number of interactions and simplifying the food web that exists within this urban river. So I'm going to go a little bit into communities over time. Secondly, I'm going to cover some trophic interactions. Third of all, I will go over diatoms in the Santa Ana sucker and some future work that I have planned. And then I will go back and cover SFS at the end, along with some other opportunities that I see from working in this system. So a lot of this work wouldn't have happened without great mentors, including my advisor, Kurt Anderson, and Larry Brown, who's pictured here, snorkeling for native fish in the Santa Ana River. And thanks to all their work and some of the monitoring of the Santa Ana that began in 2015 and is continuing to this day, to today, we can see that this river has decreased in diversity over time. So in 2015, after we found out the Santa Ana River was running dry during wastewater shutdowns, preservation projects for our native species of fish began, and we saw small increases in diversity that were non-significant. But then in 2018, we actually see a major decrease in diversity. So what could be causing this? And specifically, we see a decrease in the number of sites that contain native species. And when we look at this and we check out the largemouth bass population, we see that there was a major community shift in 2018 following groundwater wells going online. What this did was normalize flow, which Melissa talked about in the first talk of this session, and we saw a massive increase in the largemouth bass population. So what we thought was a conservation project that was going to preserve our native species that were getting trapped in wastewater shutdowns and river dry downs, instead may have been actually the cause of a massive increase in a large invasive predator in the Santa Ana River. And we saw just huge decreases, specifically in the arroyo chub population. So as we think about then how this new community will interact with one another, I decided to do a little bit of work on isotopes and trophic interactions in the Santa Ana. And I completed a small project that looked at trophic interactions across the two wastewater channels that re-wet the Santa Ana River. Key differences in this upper channel in orange, we see a collapsed food web where we primarily have macroinvertebrates and then largemouth bass and yellow bullhead catfish dominating the food web. And then in the lower channel, where we have a sort of expanded food web, we see some native species come in, and we see a much larger isotopic niche that largemouth bass, yellow bullhead, and mosquito fish are feeding in. What was most interesting was that Santa Ana sucker do not fit into our food web. They are at a higher trophic level when we're looking at isotopic nitrogen than their predator, the largemouth bass. And this is something that we struggle to reconcile. It goes against both sort of natural history and observations in the field. We've found largemouth bass that have recently fed on Santa Ana suckers, so we know that they are predating upon them. And what we're currently doing is exploring causes of this confusion. So it could be that there's a lifespan difference between collected Santa Ana sucker and the largemouth bass. So they are sequestering higher amounts of enriched nitrogen from the wastewater. The Santa Ana sucker's food supply could be more enriched from the wastewater than the largemouth basses, or we need to reassess which largemouth bass can actually predate upon Santa Ana sucker and do a deeper examination of life history. Lastly, some future work. Here is the confluence of the two wastewater channels that I mentioned. On the left is our lower channel, where we see heavy diatom and algal growth. And on the right, we see the upper channel mixing with it, where we see a more sandy, natural rocky substrate. And our preliminary results suggest that diatoms are not equally distributed within the Santa Ana River, and they are an important food source for Santa Ana sucker. And also that there is a preference by Santa Ana sucker for certain diatoms to feed upon. And this is work from a previous student that shows that the percentage of different diatoms in Santa Ana sucker feces differed from that collected from the river itself. So we want to assess how diatom communities differ across the Santa Ana River, and we're looking at 8 different river reaches, determine if Santa Ana suckers have preferred food sources using preferential feeding trials and behavioral analysis. And then lastly, we want to examine, does the current distribution of Santa Ana sucker match their feeding preference? So are they altering which habitats they're residing in to maybe get to better food sources, or are they avoiding predation from this new novel predator, the largemouth bass? All of this really comes about because there's unique opportunities that come from working in a disturbed river. There's a variety of work, including native species surveys to sort of find and count our native fish. There are conservation plans and a variety of agencies who all have cooperated with me and really empowered me to do this work and make it possible. So without them, I would not be here. And then at SFS, I really enjoy just going to a variety of urban ecology talks. They brought me a lot of different perspectives. I attended the policy section meeting of SFS for the first time, where I learned a lot about how, as freshwater scientists, we can engage in policy. And then I also have some experience working with the National Science Policy Network and the UC Riverside Science to Policy chapter, if anyone has questions about that and how I connect my science to the policy world. I built new connections with both the Cal SFS fellows and others. And lastly, in order to prepare for my new fieldwork that's beginning actually tomorrow, which is very exciting, I attended the diatom identification workshop. So I really appreciate all the sort of lessons and opportunities that being a Cal SFS fellow has provided for me. Thank you so much for listening. And I would very much like to thank and recognize the caretakers of the land and water and air that I work on in Riverside, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luceno, and Serrano peoples. And before I let you guys all ask questions, I wanted, in case you hadn't seen it, share a link with all of you. This is going to a new proposed rule from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that would open hunting and fishing rights within 90 national wildlife refuges, and comments close July 6th. If you hadn't heard about it, I would encourage you to submit a comment so that they hear from all of you who I think are invested in water and natural resources in the U.S. So thank you, and I'm ready for questions now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, William. Excellent talk. I'm going to turn it over to Peter for questions.
Thank you, William. Are the data sets you are presenting on available and accessible as open data somewhere?
Yes. So the isotope data should be posted soon. We're still finishing up all the cleanup of that, but we should post that on USGS's, I believe it's Open Science or whatever USGS's website is, and that's where we get all our community and environmental data. So USGS has posted it. If you message me afterward, I'll put my email in the chat. I can share that direct link to it with you because it's saved under some weird file name that I have to copy and paste in from my notes every time, so the correct result pops up.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions we have right now. Oh, I'm sorry. What role do you think effluent should play in the future of the Santa Ana River?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I'll keep it condensed to the few pertinent ones. I think effluent is really the only thing that's keeping this urban river alive. Even if the dams are removed, I still don't know how much water would make it down to the ocean from just the natural headwaters. So without it, I don't think we would have our extant populations of Santa Ana sucker and arroyo chub in the Santa Ana. But I think the way we have studied and normalized flows actually is extremely detrimental to Mediterranean fish species, or just most of our freshwater species here in Southern California. I would love to see and encourage municipalities and other groups that have sort of regulatory authority over this to begin managing wastewater outflows the way that would match them with historical hydrologic regimes. And that could do a lot to sort of prevent both non-native species establishment and allow native species ecological history or evolutionary history to benefit them in chances to sort of reestablish themselves in a way that they're not threatened and endangered.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions we have right now.
All right, thanks again, William. Okay, so just real quickly before I turn it over to you, Angela, I just wanted to say that these talks have been awesome. I think they've really touched on, as freshwater science does, it touched on different cultural and social and ecological aspects and how things really are all connected. So thank you all for that. I also just wanted to mention, I think we have a slide later on this, but if you liked what you heard today, in October of every year, we do an event with Cal SFS, a joint meeting, the California Aquatic Bioassessment Work Group meeting, where we have similar talks like this. So I won't spoil it. I think Angela's going to talk about it. And with that, Angela, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Allie. I'm trying to, it says I have control. Okay, there we go. Great, thank you. Okay, so yeah, thanks again so much for having us here and having the special session for Cal SFS. We really appreciate it. And again, if anybody's interested in joining our chapter and joining SFS, here is the email that you can send a note to us. Even if you have questions about anything today from the presentation, we can make sure it gets to the right presenter as well. And then if we do run off of our, we get some grants, but the chapter dues are what support our students, our early career scientists, and all the activities that we can do for our chapter. So if you're interested, in supporting our chapter, we do accept donations, and we do have a Venmo, so it's really easy. And you could just look up Bendo. This is our treasurer at CalSFS-John-Olson. And again, follow us on Twitter at CalSFS Social. We have been tweeting throughout the presentation today. There we go. And so we do some upcoming events, as Allie alluded to. So in October, the 12th and the 13th, it's a Tuesday and Wednesday, we are having the California Bioassessment Work Group. And we are planning for it to be in person. Cross fingers. It'd be so exciting to see everybody face to face and interact and network. And this is also where we have our annual CalSFS meeting. And we're going to have a workshop on tribal ecological knowledge. We're developing that now. If there's anything you would like to see as a member, for CalSFS, we are, putting on the workshops to help the membership. So there's something that, as a member, you would like to know more about. We've had our visualization workshops before. We have early career panels. We've had other sort of data intensive workshops before. So it's really, this chapter is made for the members, to help the members as the future of freshwater scientists in California. And so look out for that save the date for the bioassessment work group. And I believe the abstracts call is in August. Allie, I think that's correct. Correct me if I'm wrong.
July 9th.
There we go. Okay.
Which we might push out. So yeah.
Yeah. And we usually do a poster presentation as well. So if you're interested in having some information shared there, or you have a student in your lab, or somebody that wanted to present, we also usually do a poster presentation as well at that event. And if you just want to learn more, we have a website through Society of Freshwater Science. You want to go to MySFS and then the California chapter. We also are developing a chapter website. Thanks so much to Christine and Ryan for putting that together. It's still in the development phase, but there are examples of previous posters and lightning talks, as well as previous meetings on that website right now. But we are going to be revamping it to make it more user-friendly and have more comprehensive content for the chapter. And again, if you're interested in joining CalSFS today, there is some specific things we like to develop more focused meetings to make sure that we're serving those regional needs. We do focus on student and early career resources and opportunities. We provide lots of networking, professional growth opportunities. We have mentoring, information exchange with both the parent society, as well as other societies. Again, Society of Freshwater Science, we want to share information with other societies, agencies, organizations, and we really value the direct input from the membership on what local events we should do, where we should provide outreach, or should be involved with, as well as those outreach opportunities the chapter does. And then there's many more benefits. Again, this chapter is for the members. What we want to get out of it is what we put into it. And again, our email is at the bottom there. And then one more time, I just want to say what a great job to the fellows. You guys did a really good job today sharing your research. Thank you so much. All of you have a really, intense drive and desire to make science more accessible and more available. And I'm just so excited and proud of you guys today for your presentation. So good job. Thank you. And I hope everybody enjoys your break.
Awesome. Thank you, Angela. Yeah, we'll go ahead and go on our break. And I think we're due back at 11 o'clock, and we'll get the session going on using data to address water and racial inequities. Thanks, everybody.
Before we do that, though, there is one question. Will CABW presenters have an option to submit a pre-recorded presentation? Any thoughts, Angela or Allie?
If she's gone, I can take it.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Okay. And Angela, jump in if you are there. Yes. So as Angela mentioned, we're still kind of grappling with if we're going to be in person or remote, or some hybrid approach. So that is potentially an option, and stay tuned. We're going to send an email out as the event gets closer, with some of those details, but we're open to it. So short answer is yes-ish.
In the previous years, we had a lightning talk and poster too. So if you want to submit something that way, that can be available if you're not in person as well, if that was the question. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And thanks again, Angela. Awesome work, fellows.
Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
All right, welcome back. So, hi everyone, my name is Greg Gerhardt. I'm the moderator for this last session. I'm also Deputy Director at the State Water Board for Information Management and Analysis. I have also been honored to be part of the Cal EPA and Water Board's racial equity teams for the last 2.5 years. And I've learned a lot, and you've learned a lot with us here. This has actually been a thread that we've woven through a number of these events now, and we continually to try to get better at doing this. And this next session is really just another example of that sort of experimental mindset that we have at the whole water boards, but especially with this team of you all to keep trying to do things that make things better. So what we have in front of us today is a session that we are calling sort of open planning, building off the trend of adding open to anything that seems like it's widely more collaborative and inclusive in its process. And so you will hear some amazing presentations here about some key principles and projects and ideas and efforts that are underway to try to make not only water data more equitable in terms of the kinds of outcomes that it's achieving for the communities that are most vulnerable, but as well as the processes by which we're deciding how to engage people, the data that's either not being collected or not being used or ignored because of data quality or other issues. And so this is a very complex subject, but it deserves to be spoken to. And so together we will all have this conversation. And the vision really is that at the end of today's session, we will have established some sort of a roadmap that will lead us into projects and efforts that will carry on after this event. And then next year we will report back and we'll say, remember a year ago we said we were going to do X, Y, and Z. Here's what we learned. We ended up doing A and X and learning from how that turned into D or some poorly structured metaphor like that. But basically this is a project of doing and turning some of the stuff that is building up in us for good reasons, this tension, this urgent desire to do something, turning that into some sort of vehicle that we can move forward with together. So I first of all, welcome our panelists, and the presentations you're going to hear are going to be really inspiring, but I also welcome you all as participants to find a way to participate. And when we get to that section where we start collaborating, I will be joined along the way with sort of the team in the background, but one of the folks is going to share a Google document with folks for collecting notes, taking notes transparently, but also collecting your comments on our notes. And so you will be able to participate in the brainstorm session as we get there. So with that, we have a little welcome again from our little friends. Oh, I think I blew it. Try that again. This is supposed to make sure everyone is back. So I've watched that a number of times now, and I keep wondering what is the little squiggly guy that like dashes out of the middle of that. So if anyone knows the little squiggly guy, type it in the Q&A, please. All right. So I want to introduce our first guest, Dr. Lydia Jennings. Sort of came to us by way of lots of different pathways, lots of different connections, and but the timing was perfect because when we reached out and spoke, we found that there was this common intersection of interest and work. And so the work that is being done to identify the issues and interest behind the use of data for Indigenous people to advocate and have control has been on top of mind with the work that we've been doing in California with our tribes and our most vulnerable communities even. And so we wanted to learn more about this, and Dr. Jennings was kind enough to come and give this presentation. So if you're ready, I'm ready to hand over control to you.
I'm ready.
Okay. Do you want me to run your slides?
That would be great. So, hi everyone. I'm going to introduce you my language first. So I'm from the Pascua Yaqui tribe, and I'm coming to you today from my homelands as well as out of the Banatu Nation. Next slide, please. So I was taught that don't tell me what you know until I know who you are. So I'm going to follow those traditions. Again, as I mentioned, I'm from the Pascua Yaqui tribe. California is dear and near to my heart because I did a lot of my schooling in California. So starting as a proud community college graduate from Cabrillo, transferring to California State University, Monterey Bay, where I studied environmental science, technology, and policy, then working as a toxicologist for UC Davis, sampling all of the major rivers in California, and then eventually returning to Tucson, Arizona to complete my PhD, where I'm now a postdoc fellow in policy, community, environment, and policy. And the reason why I think this talk is so important to me today is I really want to share that in my own training in California, I was trained when it came to sampling on tribal lands, that it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And I really, at the time, I think I laughed really uncomfortably about that. But as I've moved forward and learned a lot about the policy, it's really important that moving forward, we don't train future scientists in that capacity. And so I want to talk about why and how it's important and what are the tools that we can have moving forward. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about land stewardship, about what is Indigenous data, data sovereignty, data governance, and then tools to support Indigenous data sovereignty. I'm looking forward to giving this talk. Next slide, please. So first, let's come to recognize that many US policies have been instrumental in removing Indigenous peoples from our homelands and our land management practices. So everything from manifest destiny, this idea and notion that it was God's will to prosper off of extracting from the lands and waters, to removing Indigenous people from our homelands, thinking about the California Lands Act of 1851. And that's where you really see that 1852 governmental report that the majority of Southern Californians believed it was God's will to be here, not that the Indigenous people were removed to be here and to develop California. And then everything from the Homestead Act, the General Mining Act, the Wilderness Act, that continue today. So really thinking about how our relationship with these lands are, in particularly Native people, are impacted by colonialism. And just as a reminder, the United States took more than 2 billion acres of land stewarded by Indigenous peoples through treaty or forced removal. And so many of these federal policies are really set the stage for breaking up community-held tribal lands and really attempted to erase land-based knowledge systems that are vital to ecological management. Next slide, please. So it's really critical that we recognize land stewards of the past, present, and the future. If you don't know whose traditional lands you're on, I suggest checking out nativelands.ca. They have a really great platform, and that even uses your GPS location to learn about that. As a general context, there's over 110 federally recognized tribes in California and 81 tribes currently fighting for recognition today. So by that definition, studying Indigenous land or water rights in California is going to be influenced by tribal sovereignty, by tribal data sovereignty. And for many Native communities, we see this study of our lands and waters as a political act. Next slide, please. Now, why is it important as land managers to think about Indigenous lands? Because globally, we're finding that Indigenous land stewardship is vital to biodiversity. So this is a paper from Nature looking at biodiversity metrics, both globally as well as continentally wide. And you see that all of these Indigenous lands are the most biodiverse. Can I do the animation? So Globally, Indigenous peoples manage about a quarter of the Earth's land base, but within that quarter is 80% of global biodiversity. It's resulted in high native rare species richness, less deforestation, and less land degradation. And so while Indigenous peoples are esteemed for their contributions to the protection of biological diversity, Native peoples continue to be challenged in protecting tribal self-determination, cultural stewardship, and interests on federal public lands, or even in being recognized. Next slide, please. So as we think about that data, let's kind of talk about the different definitions of data and how those might contribute to these conversations of biodiversity. So as scientists, we think about data in these very mainstream definitions, right? It's measurements or statistics using a basis for reasoning, discussion, or calculations. And we're constantly generating data, anything from our field measurements to Twitter to our financial statements. Those are constantly generating data. But the question comes is, how is the data reflecting power inequities? How is it being used by governments, industry, or non-governmental organizations? And who gets access to that data? Next slide, please. Now let's talk about how that differs, those mainstream definitions differ to what we think of as Indigenous data. So Indigenous data is really any information in any format that impacts Indigenous lives at both the collective and individual levels. So today we're talking a lot about data in that first column, data about our resources and environments. Obviously water and land data are a vital part of that. There's also data in thinking about us as individuals, our demographic data, our service use data, our own community data, and then data about us as tribal nations. So thinking about traditional and cultural information, oral histories, literature, ancestral knowledge, and that's really, coming back to our traditional ecological knowledge. Next slide, please. I wanted to give a few examples of data that we not always think about as scientists. So a big one is oral history. But oral history, not only the stories that are told, but when they're told, who they're told to. So in my tribe, there are certain stories that you only tell man to man or woman to woman. That's a way of governing our data. Other tribal communities that I know of only tell certain stories seasonally, because there are many data care practices around that and cultural health practices around that. And that's really important. Next one. Another really important thing or type of data to think about is the traditional names of outdoor spaces like mountains and rivers. And those, so this is a photo of the San Francisco Peaks in northern Arizona and Flagstaff. In every tribal nation that has Aboriginal title, which is basically in the legal definition, the right of occupancy to those mountains, have their own traditional name for it. Those names are associated with certain traditional ecological knowledge around them. So it's really important to think about how the names of our mountain spaces, which today are named after a lot of times, in many cases, colonizers, have these traditional ecological knowledge associated with them. The other part that I want to bring up is that some tribes don't want to share their name, and that's their own way of data governance. Next slide, or next animation. Another really important type of ecological knowledge is even just thinking about how artwork influences that. So this is a series of Ojibwe floral beadwork. So they've actually been working with some climate scientists at the University of Wisconsin to look at how these floral beadworks are shifting over time. And they've gone back 150 years and are really seeing how this floral beadwork is shifting, how it's telling us about the climate changing and what plants are growing. So in many senses, animation, it's really serving at this type of artistic practice is serving as the first naturalist guide of their region. And so these are really vital types of traditional ecological knowledge that these communities have governance over. Next slide. So this brings these bigger conversations about what is sovereignty. Now, generally in the United States, tribal sovereignty refers to the rights of tribal nations to govern themselves. These are rights granted by the US Constitution, by treaties, by court cases, and reaffirmed in 2020's McGritt versus Oklahoma. But what does sovereignty mean? Sovereignty means that Indigenous nations are responsible for what happens on Indigenous lands. It's not all or nothing. In many places, in many instances, it can be some governmental domains, high in some governmental domains and low in others. And it's really important to recognize how responsibility can be shared. And us as scientists working on sovereign or with sovereign nations, we have responsibility in that. Next slide. So an important part of sovereignty is self-determination. And that's really the extent that a nation is able to make and enforce its own rules, resolve disputes, problem solve when rules don't work well as others might like, and establish its own government institutions. So recognizing that sovereignty is self-determination for our communities moving forward. Next slide. Next slide, please. There we go. And part of sovereignty is governance. So governance, as we many of us think about, the systems of values, policies, institutions by which a society manages its economic, political, and social affairs through these interactions among the state, civil society, and the private sector. And so obviously you enact governance through your government. Next slide, please. So these are really kind of the mainstream definitions of both thinking about governance and sovereignty. Now we apply that to data, right? So data sovereignty being this concept that information which has been converted and stored in binary digital form is subject to the laws of the country in which it's located. So really recognizing how data sovereignty is both geographically bound digital information. And some of the work that's been interesting in our work is seeing how some communities, Indigenous communities internationally, won't use Google documents because of the data sovereignty governance in that country versus in the United States versus in their country. And so coming to data governance refers to this ownership, collection, control, analysis, and use of their data, which thinking of corporate ownership of data, something like Facebook or Google, and how those can impact data sovereignty. Next slide. So Indigenous data sovereignty is really the right of Indigenous people and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. And so this really, again, comes from this inherent right of us as Indigenous peoples to govern our peoples, our lands, and our resources. And the genesis of Indigenous data sovereignty comes from our traditions, roles, and responsibilities in use of the community-held information. And use and also reuse is really important. It's positioned within these human rights frameworks, court cases, treaties, and even just being recognized as a tribal nation. And I mentioned those 81 tribes in California fighting for tribal recognition. And this is one of the reasons why is this Indigenous data sovereignty component. And I think a really important part for those trained in the settler colonial practices versus traditional ecological knowledge practices is that in Indigenous communities, this knowledge is held as a collective, and it's really fundamental to who we are as people. Next slide. So this slide is really just to reaffirm that Indigenous data sovereignty comes from our federal and state recognition, our court cases, and our treaties. And so as we think about Indigenous data sovereignty, it's really concerned with the rights of Indigenous people to own, control, and access, as well as possess data that derives from us and pertains to our tribal members, our knowledge systems, our customs, and territories. These rights are supported by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and endorsed by the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Privacy. Within these rights of Indigenous data sovereignty, the desire of data to be used in ways that support and enhance the collective well-being of our nations and determination, self-determination as Indigenous peoples. Next slide. Now, thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty, one thing I really want to point out, and I see this all the time in environmental impact statements or environmental assessments, is that tribal nations are not stakeholders. We are rights holders. And that's really important to affirm because we are a separate political entity. And so thinking about data sovereignty and governance, the question often comes up is what should we do as non-Indigenous scientists? Who is responsible and who is responsible to kind of asserting sovereignty or supporting sovereignty? And the larger point I want to make today is that everyone is. So again, data sovereignty, our data repositories, publishers, researchers, universities, granting agencies, other governments, all of these need to be changing their practices to align with Indigenous expectations of data. And so really thinking about what are our unique responsibilities in these different capacities to support the rights holders of data. Next slide. So I want to go through a couple of, So I just want to go through a couple of examples of how tribal nations are leading the scientific inquiry process to support sovereignty. Next slide. So one great example is this partnership between the Karuk tribe and UC Berkeley to address biocolonialism, restoration, and land management. And they've actually drafted this practicing peekaboo. I hope I pronounced that correctly. If I don't, I apologize. But peekaboo is really this idea of preparing an ecosystem and recognizing that they as a people, as a group of people, are responsible to prepare their ecosystem. And so they've developed this, this collaborative protocol to think of active engagement in research programs that they are currently informing land management policy change and restoration activities along the Klamath River Basin. And so they launched this guiding principles to really govern how future research and other collaborative projects with the Karuk tribe can move forward to really ensure protection of intellectual and cultural property that recognize tribal sovereignty. So they really hope with this practice to prevent exploitative relationships by creating a clear definition of what collaborative research or consent means leading forward. And a key component of this is establishing free, prior, and informed consent over information sharing practices. Next slide. Another great example is that what is happening. So that was a California example, and I'm going to do larger in the United States, but this example is from the Fond du Lac Tribal Nation. And so their community is being heavily impacted by both copper mines in their community, as well as natural gas pipelines. And what they found is that in the environmental impact statements, their traditional ecological knowledge was not being seen as valid knowledge, as valid scientific knowledge. So they decided that they were going to do a partnership with the University of Minnesota and their tribal college to train their own community scientists moving forward so that they can conduct those environmental impact statements in a way that is culturally aligned with their values. And so they've actually, it's I think gone 5 years now and has produced some really exciting results. And moving into the future is to ensure that their community members are conducting those impact statements that better represent their communities moving forward. Next slide. Now I want to talk a little bit about Indigenous data governance. And so really Indigenous data governance is a way that a society organizes itself to make and implement decision making. And it's critical to exercising tribal sovereignty because we know we have to have good data to make good decision making. But often we see that there's a gap in knowledge about Indigenous communities, particularly in answering and addressing questions that Indigenous communities have. And so this is really an effort to reallocate authority over data back to Indigenous peoples. Next slide. So this is an introduction to the data paradigm or the hierarchy of Indigenous data. And this is a complex slide, so we're gonna take a few seconds on here. What I wanna point out is that gray is kind of where we currently are at, and those in the teal are kind of where we aspire to be. And you see us or them. And so the us in this circumstance is really referring to us as Indigenous peoples, and them is the larger scientific community. And so currently we're often in a state of data dependency where Indigenous peoples and data have long been suppressed or usurped to meet the needs and desires of either state or federal government reporting agencies, or even just thinking about who's asking the research questions. At the tippy top in this teal color, that's really where we want to go. So Indigenous scholars, both academic and traditional knowledge experts, are leading in creating data knowledge and information with the ultimate goal to co-produce data that really drives state and federal policy. As researchers, we strive to be the top 3 layers, but realistically, we have to be active in all layers of this giant data sphere. And really thinking about how we use data to exert sovereignty and how we build and maintain partnerships, both tribal and non-tribal, moving forward. The last part that I think is really important in this sphere is how we empower young people and cultural advisors to generate data and to be fluent in data science. Next slide. So a few examples of data, of Indigenous data governance. Next slide. One of my favorite California examples is the work that's happening out of the Yurok tribe, particularly around food sovereignty. So they recognize that pesticides were having a major issue and really impacting a lot of their salmon fisheries and salmon flows. And so they've actually been working with their legislation and their tribal lawyers, and they developed this really innovative and important pesticide ordinance. And so they've really worked with the judicial collaborations around pesticides, identifying which pesticides they want banned. They've banned a variety of different pesticides and working on creating these ordinances to inform community members what are banned, having a transition plan, working on a very comprehensive pesticide education plan, and then also actually having working with the tribal police to enforce community policing and addressing these banned pesticides. They're also working on something very similar with genetically modified foods. So I think it's going to be really exciting to continue to watch what the Yurok tribe does. Next slide, please. Another great example of data governance is even just looking at these large observation networks. And so this is a open traditional ecological knowledge data sovereignty statement coming from the local indicators of climate change impacts observation network. And so they really recognized while open science is great in a lot of contexts, for Indigenous communities, they may not want their knowledge to be completely open. And so while it was initially a citizen science platform, it's currently being reconfigured to meet the demands of their partner tribal nations, and specifically meet the diverse and context-specific requirements and values of Indigenous ownership of knowledge and relationships to uses. So now they're changing and ensuring that there's Indigenous authority over control and access, prioritizing collective benefits over individual benefit, and recognition of context-specific uses. So I think this is a really powerful example of a data statement that's being really clear and transparent about how their data is being used moving forward to protect tribal sovereignty. Next slide. So now what are tools for us as scientists to think about how we can support data sovereignty moving forward? Next slide. If anything you take away from here today, I really want to suggest that you use the fair and care principles. And so really recognizing that those who are working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how that data are used and support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit moving forward. And this requires accountability and really meaningful and open and available conversations about the benefits or lack of benefits occurring to Indigenous peoples. So because of this, these fair and care principles have been developed. So really thinking about how the data that you're generating are being findable, accessible, interpretable, understandable to Indigenous communities, and how it's being reused. Additionally, there have been developed the care principles, and that was really after more and more science became open data or big data, open source. And so really thinking about these other aspects of collective benefit, authority to control, the responsibility and ethics moving forward. Next slide. So a couple of cases or tools that have been developed to really address these are the local context traditional knowledge labels, which you can see here. These are digital tags that ensure protocols travel with the data and really help maintain our connection to the data through provenance tracking that can reflect general purposes being permitted. Next slide. And so here's just one example of the Pasquati song. These were really initially created to an effort by the tribe to reestablish relationships with the songs. And they are put in place by the communities, not by the collections or researchers. And these labels correct attributions and other information, they relate expectations for use. Next slide. This is just kind of an example of it within the digital infrastructure for those of you who do the programming side to see how those are put into the digital infrastructure. Next slide. Another great tool is the Mukuutu. It's a free mobile and open source platform built with Indigenous communities to manage and share digital cultural heritage. This is a grassroots project aimed to empower communities to manage, share, narrate, and exchange their digital heritage in culturally relevant and ethically minded ways. And so this actually has a series of different types of password protected layers based on the community's desire to really control who has access to this information. Next slide. I think what's really important is moving forward to think about what are our relational responsibilities to Indigenous communities and data. So one of our Maori collaborators, they really remind us to switch from who are we talking to instead to who are we talking on behalf of, and really what do the rights interests mean in those particular settings. So thinking about those rights to know, the ability to track the uses of data and who has access to them, the right to govern, supporting the participation in protocols and decision-making about access to the data that should be in the community's hands, the right to benefit, supporting the opportunity to benefit from the use of the data and equitable benefit sharings from derivatives of the data. Again, that comes down to how do you reuse the data? And then also recognizing the right to privacy. Some communities don't want the information shared and they want to be erased from the data, and that is their right as a sovereign nation. Next slide. So now moving forward and thinking about Indigenous knowledge and data, there are always going to be infrastructure challenges, right? Every Indigenous community has enormous collections of data, of archives, and museum libraries, and other online repositories. But there's also information missing about them, and particularly around the provenance and the individual and community names. And so one example I often think about is the SEIU net. And I use that a lot in identifying plants in my PhD. And it'll say Indigenous uses of this plant mean X, Y, and Z, but they never say the tribal nations that it comes from. So that's really important moving forward, is identifying which communities and which knowledge holders that information is attributed to. Also really important to recognize that there are many places that data collected about us that we're not the legal rights holders. And how do we change that moving forward as scientists? As well as thinking about the issues of responsibility and ownership, particularly as we generate more and more metadata and digital archives. And then lastly is, as more and more researchers are working on collecting data and sampling with Indigenous communities or on Indigenous communities, particularly in relations to biodiversity, how are we moving forward and thinking about the protections and the rights that that new data we're generating has? Next slide. So lessons moving forward. It's really important that we make sure that all the findings are accessible to Indigenous community members. Otherwise, we are complicit in helicopter science. And if you don't know what that is, it's this process of going in and collecting samples and then leaving without sharing the information with the community experts. Also, how are the findings being reported in a context that's relevant to Indigenous community concerns, issues, or interests? How are the community members being credited for the knowledge contributions? Are they being acknowledged? Are they being co-authored? Are they being compensated for their expertise? How are the studies reporting ethical guidelines followed, such as the free and prior to informed consent protocols, which again are stipulated by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as treaties. And next is, how do the studies address intellectual property rights or risks for the community? How do the research that we do cause no harm? And I think one of the most simple things is to think about, how are the studies reporting outcomes or outputs to community members? So it's really critical that we think about these as we move forward and conduct our science. Next slide. I think time and time again, I'm going to come back to this point that we as scientists need to recognize how tribal nations and other ways of knowing are resilient entities whose scientific contributions have been peer-reviewed across generation and generation and generation, but whose knowledge has not gotten recognized. And so I often think going through the peer review process right now on a paper is that it's considered legitimate because I have 3 experts in that field peer reviewing a paper versus Indigenous knowledge systems that have gone through generations and generations and generations of knowledge, but are not seen as legitimate. How do we change that or reframe that moving forward? And so with that, next slide, please. So with that, I just want to thank you for your time and for thinking about this, which is thank you in my language, and blessings. And also to recognize that I am here speaking on behalf of the work of many other Indigenous scholars and really amplifying your expertise in addition to my own scholarship. And so I just want to go ahead and highlight those groups. I think you should follow all of them on Twitter because our collaborations are generating really important work to continue to think about these issues. And with that, thank you for your time. I'm excited to answer your questions.
Hi, Lydia, thank you. I have a comment and a question for you. First, the comment, this is not a question, but this was amazing. Thank you for this presentation, Lydia, coming from Molly Williams in OPP. So I think reiterated by many people, thank you very much. That was an amazing presentation. And now for the question, can the State Water Board do anything specifically now to improve our respect towards tribal data sovereignty in our region?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of things the state can do. I mean, again, these aspects of data sharing protocols need to be established with tribal nations. I think, thinking of just having these conversations of how is data protected, how are tribal nations leading the conversations? how many tribal representatives are on the California Water Board? It's a really critical one. Arizona, I think, is the only state that I'm aware of that does have someone from the Gila Indian River community on the state water board. Why isn't that the case in California? And if I'm misinformed about California, please correct me. But I think those are just some really important things to think about how we can make water science and data science more equitable, is ensuring that we have more of those community members on those boards. I also mentioned continuing to work with Indigenous youth is going to be really vital. I just finished up a workshop last week on Indigenous data mining. And I think that was just a really fascinating process of how we think about water and data a little bit differently and more in relationship. And I think moving forward, these conversations and having Indigenous scholars in these places is going to continue to be pivotal for all of us, not just for Indigenous communities. So those are a few examples. And I would really highly recommend going and looking at the fair and care principles and thinking about how your institutions can implement those into your practices as a first step.
Okay, fantastic. I don't know, do we have time for one more? We have another question that came up. Greg, do I have time?
Go ahead.
Okay, this is going to be a long one to listen to, but there's so great presentation. In my community in County, California.
I'm having a hard time hearing you. Sorry, it's going in and out.
Oh, I might be losing my connection a little bit. Is this, am I a bit better?
Yes.
Okay. I'm trying to incorporate the traditional First Nations names and references for landmarks and locations when we're designating or designing environmental projects and conducting community outreach and education. But some local dialects result in different words and conventions. How can I incorporate the Indigenous naming conventions in a mindful way? Is this harming more than helping to restore Native identity, especially as these labels, much like site names, become connected to the data and is being collected throughout the projects?
I mean, so I personally would say you should incorporate all of them. So part of that there might be difference in dialects is, so we know that colonization has been really effective. A lot of communities have lost traditional language speakers. And so, I mean, I'm seeing this in my own, we have multiple words for the same thing, in part because it's people learning it from different places. And I think this is a really vital part of, many of your speakers today gave land acknowledgements, which is important, but how do we move beyond the land acknowledgements? And part of that is establishing these relationships with communities who could actually tell you what the best definition is, what they've officially agreed on. But I also think that it's just really important to include a variety of those, because as an external researcher, you don't know what is the best one, and it's not really your place to say which one is the most accurate one, right? That's a role of a traditional knowledge holder. So that's what I would say. But again, I think it's going to be, on all of these conversations, it's really critical that we establish a relationship with tribal partners who can be the experts on what that would be, and we move beyond. How do we move beyond land acknowledgement, which I think is really important. And actually at UC Davis, Dr. Middleton is doing a lot of really important work on that topic. And so I highly recommend checking out her work on that. Any more questions?
Sorry, one more question that came in. I had muted myself because my dog was barking. Any idea how the CARE principles would apply to collecting and publishing stream gauge data?
Yeah, I mean, I think the CARE principles, again, how are you making it accessible to community members? Is that something that you can work with a tribal environmental department to put it on their tribal website so community members can see that? I think the other part is really like making it interpretable or accessible. Is also how are we communicating that? So one of the ways of understanding that in some communities, they might not have many scientists or people are really as literate in scientific measurements, is also using tribal artists as a way of helping to communicate that. And so I think that's also a really valuable output moving forward. But I think there's a variety of ways of doing so. We can definitely talk about it more in depth.
That's a wonderful segue. Thank you so much, Dr. Jennings. Your presentation was extremely informative to me and helpful. And I was the one that asked the question of what the State Water Board can do. So I may follow up with you on some of those ideas. But we now have the pleasure of having additional speakers, and then we'll get into the collaborative dialogue. So thank you, Dr. Jennings, very much. Our next speaker is Walker Wieland. He is from the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, been a long partner and champion of using environmental data to do good in not only California, but the whole United States. So Walker is here to share some of his work about Cal EnviroScreen and to give us some inspirational ideas on what that data set can do.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate the invitation to come speak. I want to thank Greg, Anna, and everyone else who helped put this symposium on. Dr. Jennings, that was fantastic, really great, and I'll do my best to follow it. My talk's going to be quick. I only have about 10 minutes, and so I tried to be efficient and not have a title slide, but now I'm realizing that I haven't really explained who I am. So I'll just take a moment to do that. My name is Walker Wieland, and I'm a research scientist with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. I've been with that office for 10 years, and the primary project that I work through is this project called Cal EnviroScreen. So what I'm going to talk about in this period of time is to talk about how this tool helps us to address and identify inequities related to race, related to water, related to a number of other type of environmental pollutants and vulnerabilities. And so I think this Venn diagram here does a pretty good job of simply explaining what Cal EnviroScreen is meant to be. It captures at a community scale various metrics of pollution burden, but also considers people living in the community and what sort of characteristics they have. And really the combination of those two represents cumulative impacts in communities, which is the major focus of Cal EnviroScreen. Next slide, please. So I like to describe the public process around Cal EnviroScreen as being a feedback loop. This is the 4th version of Cal EnviroScreen that we're working on right now, due out in its final form later this year. Through each version, we've had a public process where when we met in person, we sat down in various communities throughout the state, extended the use of our plotter at the maximum in the office, and printed out a bunch of different maps, put them down at the table, sat around the table with community members and said, this is our best attempt at characterizing conditions in the community. What do you think? Is this somewhat on base, or do you think this is off base entirely and we're missing something here? The public feedback loop for Cal EnviroScreen has helped increase geographic resolution, identify indicators, and also methodologies that we've incorporated into the tool that we really, our own team really would have not been able to do without the help of people in the community and giving honest feedback about how a small office and a government entity is doing in an attempt to characterize cumulative impacts in that community. Next slide. So for those of you who might have heard of Cal EnviroScreen, you may be using this map on the right that shows at a census tract level what cumulative impacts are as measured by our tool. But Cal EnviroScreen is really 21 different maps that are all combined with one another that characterize exposures to people, whether it's the air you're breathing or the water you're drinking, but also facilities nearby, maybe a smelly composting facility or a Superfund site. But then it also considers what are health conditions that people may have that might make them more sensitive to the effects of pollution, metrics such as asthma and low birth weight, and finally socioeconomic based variables that really influence people's resilience or vulnerability to pollution, such as poverty, and another one regarding risk communication, such as linguistic isolation. Next slide. So we have a number of resources that I just wanted to hit on that were coming out with version 4.0 of Cal Enviroscreen. In the top left is called the Cal Enviroscreen Hub, and it's essentially constructed as a flexible open data site. But it's something that I really have an interest in expanding post version 4.0 of Cal Enviroscreen into something that's more about data discovery and linking back to source databases. And what I mean by that is, I think a lot of people that are using Cal Enviroscreen might be looking at pesticides data or linguistic isolation data or ozone data for the first time in terms of this state database that houses and essentially is the subject matter expert on this particular data set. So it's really about responsibility on our end to show where we're getting this information from, how we're analyzing the data, and how it's being used and how you can use it too. And so that's a big focus that what we're trying to do with the hub. In the top right, there's a screenshot of our indicator level maps. Here you can view any one of the 21 indicators in Cal Enviroscreen, look at facility level data, look at intermediate level data sets. And so what I mean by that is these are data that are not necessarily captured in the or reported in the overall results of the tool, but instead really carry significance to it that may be of interest, such as the top 5 pesticides being used, in your community. We generate training videos around Cal Enviroscreen. This is ways for us to try to get the information out and make it more widely accessible, available in English and Spanish. And in the bottom right is another a project that we're working through. It's called a data dashboard. It's basically filtering, sharding, and data flexibility around Cal Enviroscreen. So in this screenshot here, we're looking at just Alameda County and viewing some submetrics out of just that county based on that filter. All of these efforts are around, these are all 4 of these are relatively new, that were not present in past versions of the tool, or at least not as early available as in past versions. And so these are ones that we're really trying to push out earlier and in a more open and transparent way. Next slide. So with Cal Enviroscreen, we generate data and results on the inequitable distribution of burden as it relates to race. Cal Enviroscreen is essentially an environmental justice tool that talks about environmental racism, and it talks about ways that environmental pollutants are disproportionately located where people of color primarily live. So, one easy way to slice this is looking at via Cal Enviroscreen, 10% least impacted versus most impacted. It's a huge difference in regard to people of color versus white. Next slide. And so with the chart on the left, each horizontal bar represents a Cal Enviroscreen decile where we're going through the data. And if you look at the top bar and then that has a 1 and then the bar that has a 10, that's the 10% least burden and most burden. And then look at the pink versus the blue. That's percent Latino versus percent white. And the point I'm making is that those 2 values are essentially reversed from one another when you look at the most impacted versus the least impacted. So in the top 10% most impacted Cal Enviroscreen communities, they are 73% Latino and 10% white. And then with a story map we've released with this draft version of 4.0, you can now investigate these results spatially. So you're able to, view these interactive maps and look at these patterns and get a better understanding of cumulative impacts and race, which is what we're trying to do. Next slide. And so this final graphic in this short period of time that I have to show is, it's essentially what are your chances? And it's this really stark difference between Latino, African American, and Native American and versus white in regards to if you are of a certain race, what are your chances of living in a disadvantaged community as identified by Cal Enviroscreen, and further reinforces this concept that race is in fact a determinant of environmental justice and environmental racism. Next slide. So just to close it out, where are we going? We're working now to finalize the 4th version of Cal Envirus Screen. And we've gotten, I think, 50 comment letters and a couple of hundred comments through our past public process around the tool over the past couple of months. These comments are what drive the evolution of Cal Envirus Screen. And so we're making edits and changes where we can now, but we're really taking all of that and working on it as we work towards version 5.0. What are people saying about their communities? What are the issues of concern? How can we form research projects around that to address those and better characterize communities and cumulative impacts in communities? These last 3 bullets here are focuses around expansion of Cal Envirus Screen. There's a lot of interest in changes over time. And so we've identified processes for evaluating changes over time. And an overarching theme of what we need to do better in Cal Envirus Screen is that we need to better characterize cumulative impacts in tribal nations in California while respecting data sovereignty, and also better characterize cumulative impacts in rural areas in California where the issues are different than that of urban places in California. And last but not least, this last point here is really about making the tool flexible, conceptually, geographically, being able to bring in data that might not necessarily be available in Cal Envirus Screen already. Thinking about Cal Envirus Screen locally, how do we make the tool, the data more interoperable and the tool more flexible to a wider audience for more purposes? Next slide. And I think that's it. So there's my email. Please email me, reach out if you want to talk about these things more. I want to make sure, though, that I have enough time, or I'm sorry, that others have enough time on this panel to speak. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Walker. This is great. So I want people to be thinking about it in the context of collecting ideas for what we can do in the coming year. And that was a really inspirational idea for a treasure trove of what we know, sort of some of us who are on the inside know that's there, but there's so much that hasn't been done and could be done still with those data sets. And really, really appreciate you, Walker, talking about that and for advocating and pushing for open data behind it all. So thank you.
Thank you.
Moving on, we're going to do these pretty quickly. We're going to save these questions for the panelists at the end, the lightning talk panelists. We're going to do them all together at the end, and then we'll break into some dialogue. So I'm going to move us to Jamie Huynh at Cal Recycle. Jamie is another awesome partner who has been part of our Cal EPA racial equity team, along with Walker and myself and others doing this work for a couple of years. And she's going to talk about one of our really cool projects that has developed a story map that is full of some really cool information. So Jamie, take it away if you're ready. I can do your
Thank you so much, Greg. I think I might share my screen.
I can do that too.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Huynh. I am an environmental scientist here at Cal Recycle. I am also our lead for our communications sub-team for the Cal EPA racial equity team. And so the premise of this pollution and prejudice project, thank you, Anna, for including it in the chat, was kind of started when we worked, oops.
You're still not controlling the screen yet. So if you want to click on it, you should have control, or you should just click the share button and then stop me from sharing. I think everyone's still seeing the title slide.
Yeah, it shows that I'm not allowed to share my screen. I'm sorry.
Do you want me to pull up the story map and
yes, please.
Just follow? Sure.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Give me a second here.
I'll kind of go over the background while you get the link up. So about in 2018, we were working with communities in Stockton, California, on environmental issues. And while we were consulting with them on what they wanted us as Cal EPA to work on, they were actually more focused on social justice issues. And so we incorporated redlining into how we structured and prioritized our efforts into the Stockton area. And so this project kind of stemmed from that. And so this project explores how historical redlining from the 1930s impacts environmental conditions today, and what the demographics look like in these areas. So redlining was a practice back in the 1930s where the US government had appraisers, evaluators go around to cities with over 40,000 people and evaluate the risk of each area. And so like you can see in this Oakland map here, they graded it A, B, C, and D, best, still desirable, definitely declining, and hazardous. And the red areas are what we end up calling redlining. And so through this project, there are two maps that you can explore. One is an interactive GIS map where you can actually explore the CalEnviroscreen scores, which Walker had just presented on, and its relation to redlining. And you'll see that a lot of the redlined areas, the yellow and red areas, will have more environmental burden than the green and blue areas. Sorry, sometimes it takes a little longer to load. And you can actually click on these shapes and get the original text that these evaluators had written, some of which are explicitly racist. So thank you, Greg, for clicking around there. And one of the other tools that is included in this story map is the Shiny App tool. And in this, sorry, it's all the way in the bottom. And in this tool, you can actually look at all the enforcement data that Cal EPA and its boards, departments, and offices have. You can see where we prioritize our enforcement, where we do inspections, and in relation to redlining. Thank you, Greg, for showing this. Oops. Perfect. Here you can actually select, go through quite a few selections. You can either look at water, air, hazardous waste, or all other data that is available. So you can kind of overlay that over redlining areas to see how well we've done our job, or how well and so it is a start for, oops, since my internet connection is unstable, I hope you all can still hear me. This project is just a start to our conversation at state government in recognizing systemic racism and environmental racism, and addressing that and taking action for that. So thank you, Greg.
Sure, we can leave it up for a second while it loads. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how this analysis also sort of made its way into the story map. These are kind of two tools that are like overlaid on top of each other, right?
Sorry, I forgot I muted myself.
So this summary of the analysis from that redline tool that is slow to load on my machine, sorry, but the summary is in the story map as well. There's also this particular analysis is available, I think, in the hub project that CalEnviroscreen is providing. So there's just a lot of interesting stuff that's kind of evolving and moving forward on this. Thank you, Jamie. All right, so I am going to now go back to the slideshow, hopefully. And our next panelist is Anna Holder. And Anna's going to talk about her work with the Swamp's Safe to Eat Fish program. So take it away, Anna, if you're ready.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And I only have a couple of slides, so if you can advance them for me, that would be great. Again, my name is Anna Holder. I am an environmental scientist with the California Water Boards in the Office of Information Management and Analysis. I am the program coordinator for a bioaccumulation monitoring program. And that's a lot of, it's a mouthful. But basically the kind of reason for this program, our responsibility for the program given to us by the legislature is to figure out if fish in California water bodies are safe to eat or not. The program's been going for about 14 years now, and we've had a lot of successes. We've built lots of collaborations with folks at OEHA and Fish and Wildlife and Moss Landing Marine Labs, and San Francisco Estuary Institute, and have kind of built a community and a process to get this monitoring done and get it communicated out into the public. Through fish advisories, 303D impairment listings, TMDLs, and lots of other things. Since it's been 14 years, and next slide, please, we kind of wanted to take a step back and reassess how we're doing. A lot of great things have been done over the past 14 years, but what do we want our next 14 years to look like, and how can we do better? And through that, internal and kind of a little bit of external assessment, we found that there were two major gaps that we wanted to address. One was we've built all these collaborations and partnerships with external agencies and groups, but we need to do a little bit better internally within the water boards, within different regions and programs, to better communicate the work that we do, the data that's available, and how it can help inform decisions in other programs and regions. And then the realignment, as we're calling it, is the main focus is incorporating perspectives of communities and tribes that depend on fish or shellfish for subsistence. If we're talking about if fish are safe to eat, we should be talking to the people that are eating fish to figure out if we're meeting their needs, right? And so through this realignment process, we're building a community advisory committee, and the next slide, please, that will be focused in each region. We could have done a big statewide kind of process, but we want each region to kind of get the attention that it deserves. We're trying to be very intentional through this process, and really dedicate time and resources to listening to what the communities and tribal governments tell us that they need. And so this advisory committee will have one in each region, and that's basically what the purpose is to listen, and not just water board folks, but all of the other agencies that are collaborators through this process. They're joining that at this point virtual table, so that we can listen to each other and learn from each other, and build relationships, so that, and again, realign the program so that the next 15 years and the 15 years after that can address those needs in short-term, monitoring and assessment, but also through the long-term program structure in itself. Next slide, please. We're starting in the San Diego region, down at the bottom of the state in Region 9, and each kind of realignment session, I guess, will be generally a 3-year process. This is our pilot region, so maybe it'll change based on the debrief processes and the things that we hear back from the folks that are participating. You'll see those little blue kind of triangles throughout the timeline. Those are committee meetings where we're going to meet and touch base and talk about the different things that are on our minds through this process and how we can improve the program in the short and long term. One important thing to note is we have dedicated funding separate from our regular monitoring that has been happening for the past 14 years, but specific to the advisory committee recommendations on what needs to be addressed now, what needs to be monitored now, so that we can start getting that data in and making more informed decisions sooner rather than later. And then next slide, and this will be my last. And since we're talking about racial equity for this panel and really throughout this entire symposium, I wanted to highlight really the 4 things for me that are critical through this realignment process, and the practices, the things that we're doing to try and do better to align towards racial equity. The first, and we've heard it today and yesterday, is including community-based organizations and tribes, incorporating their perspectives, and really using them to make decisions. So not just, checking a box and saying, well, we invited you, but we're not going to listen to what you said. That's no good. We need to, take the time to listen and learn and evolve so that we're meeting the needs of the people that we serve. Another big focus through this realignment is building bridges to relationships and trust. Dr. Jennings' presentation made very clear that there's a lot of trust that has been broken over time by governments in general with tribes and underserved communities, and we can't just show up and expect trust to be given to us, right? So we need to build the relationships and earn that trust back, and so that's another component of this. The next one is compensation for time and expertise. We have funding set aside to compensate community representatives and tribal representatives for their time. As government agencies, we pay contractors for their technical expertise. But as, again, Dr. Jennings mentioned, the knowledge that is within communities and tribes that has been passed on through generations is equally as valuable and deserves to be compensated similarly. And then finally, we just had our first meeting last week on Friday, and one of the big things that was mentioned many, many times is actually doing something with the information that is being shared through this process. And so we're going to utilize the guidance of each advisory committee to inform, as I mentioned, near-term monitoring and data collection, and then also long-term monitoring, which might be a slower shift, but we're going to be working on it. And that's all I have. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, our next lightning panelist here is Tara Moran. She is the newish director of the Water Data Consortium, a strong partner in the space of doing water data, making it more open and accessible, but also recently, clearly a partner in making it equitable. And so Tara, take it away if you're ready.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. Thank you to Greg and Anna for their work on this panel and for everyone who's brought this event together. Greg, I am not able to turn my video on. I don't know if that's on your end, but it says because the host stopped it. There we go. Great. Great. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, just a huge thank you to Anna and Greg for their work on this panel and everyone who's brought the event together. And then, of course, to fellow panelists, it's been incredibly enlightening. So thank you. And it's such an honor to be here and be part of this. I'm Tara Moran. I'm CEO of the California Water Data Consortium. And I'll talk a little bit about the organization, given how new it is. And many of you may not be familiar with it and sort of our role in all of this. My presentation is going to take a slightly different tack. And I'll give just a little bit of background on the consortium, as well as part of the role that we are hoping to play and eager to play as part of this conversation moving forward. And hopefully that will tee up some of the discussion moving forward. So we at the California Water Data Consortium obviously care immensely about water data and information in California and beyond. But I want to be really clear that we care about data and access to high quality data that can be shared and integrated across regions, because having that information results in better more sustainable and more equitable water outcomes for all Californians. And so for us, that really is the goal. And as we've heard here today, we're certainly making progress on that front, but frankly, there's still a lot of work to be done. So currently there are more than 1 million Californians who lack access to safe and affordable drinking water that meets established water quality standards. And these conditions are expected to worsen during our current drought, just as they did during the last. When thousands of domestic wells went dry or were impacted by emerging contaminants. And so we had to ship water into those communities who didn't have access to safe water, and the majority of which were small rural communities with high proportions of lower income residents and Latino residents. Similarly, we heard from Walker and Jamie about how historical, and Dr. Jennings, how historical practices have really taken power away from many communities and resulted in many injustices there as well. So moving forward, it's imperative that we have better information about the number of drying domestic wells, of pollution load, cumulative impacts, and the like, so that we really can understand the impacts of our decisions on the impacts of drought, and changing water quality on wells and the like moving forward, to make a whole host of more informed water management decisions. And the consortium was really formed to help meet those needs. So as a little bit of background, during the last drought, it became really clear that both state and local agencies didn't have the information that they needed to make well-informed water management decisions. So in response to that need, the California legislature passed the Open and Transparent Water Data Act, which includes several mandates, but importantly, it requires state agencies to make publicly available water and ecological data sets available on open data platforms and to update them quarterly. Similarly, it requires water and ecological data sets related to California water supply held by federal agencies to make those publicly available on those same data platforms and to update them quarterly. However, during drafting of the legislation, there was recognition that the legislative mandates in the Open and Transparent Water Data Act could be met, but that they wouldn't necessarily meet these broader legislative requirements of making sure that the data are actually, that the data available on the platform would actually be accessible, that they would be findable, that people would use them, and they would actually be used to inform water management decisions. And so we've heard about some of those principles here today. And so there was recognition that achieving those broader goals would require ongoing collaboration and dialogue between both state agencies and the state agencies implementing the legislation, as well as non-state agency representatives, including water agencies, private sector, tribes, academia, NGOs, and many others, community-based organizations and many others, to jointly make decisions on critical water management decisions and potential solutions to address them. And so the bill really included a clause enabling the Department of Water Resources to partner with a nonprofit organization who could play this role. And that really is what led to the creation of the California Water Data Consortium. So we were formed in 2019, and I was hired in August of 2020. And we're now advancing several pilot projects to demonstrate the value of open and transparent water data for improved water management outcomes. And as a new organization, we have both an opportunity and an obligation to think about the organization that we're building, to learn from others, and really to challenge ourselves to go beyond the status quo. And so I'm really grateful to be part of this panel, because I really would like to learn from everyone here, both panelists as well as the audience, and really think about how we embed inclusion, equity, and justice into the consortium and the work that we do. And so I've laid out the following sort of 4 goals for the consortium, as well as we think about equity, inclusion, and justice in our work. And so for us, we're really, our goal is to, number 1, come into this space from a place of humility and with the desire to learn from others and provide a safe place for others to learn together, for all of us to learn together. We also recognize that as we embark on this journey of building equity, diversity, and justice into the consortium's work, that we aren't going to get everything right. And so we're going to assume, number one, that the best of intentions of others, when they fall short, and provide feedback to help them avoid future missteps, and would encourage others to do the same for us. And we'll all do this because we recognize that showing up and takes courage, and that doing something rather than just standing by is going to be a really critical part of the solution. We're going to support projects designed by and for underrepresented communities. And then finally, we'd like to provide a venue to better understand issues of equity, injustice, or inclusion and injustice, and that the consortium is embedding anti-racism, inclusion, and justice into our work moving forward. And so we're going to talk a little bit about a roadmap moving forward and what that might look like. But the consortium is really committed to hosting working groups where we can all jointly learn from one another, where we can sort of vet our own projects, but ideally that others can do the same, and love to hear your ideas on how to do that moving forward. And so I will pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. Great setup and lead in. So at this point, I welcome someone else to share the screen of the Google Doc in my amazing production team.
Hi, Greg. We have
Yeah.
one question directly associated with one of the presentations here. So if you wouldn't mind, I will get information. And this one is directed to Jamie and the redlining presentation. So the question is, this redlining component is so valuable and needed to ensure equity. Do you know if these maps are being widely deployed and adopted? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bev, and thanks to whoever asked this question. Thanks to University of Richmond and their Mapping Inequality project, which is where we got these redlining maps and all the underlying evaluations of these redlined areas. It is very publicly available, and you can download that data and play with it yourself. We've seen quite a few like New York Times articles and other scholars using these maps to create their own research, such as Jeremy Hoffman's Heat Island article. And I think, Greg, you had included some other social vulnerability articles in the chat as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, that foundational data set is incredibly rich. And I think we're just starting to see people explore it. But there's a lot of other, I know that we've seen papers, Jamie, write on like oil and gas in LA that looked at redlining. And then there's that sort of famous asthma paper that we talk about too, but yeah. Great question. So, all right, if there are no other questions, what I'd like to do now is to invite the panelists to turn their microphones and videos on again, and we'll sort of sit up here like a panel and we'll brainstorm and we'll take ideas from anyone. I welcome people in the audience to access the Google Doc, and the instructions are basically self-explanatory, but type in like either a comment or a suggested idea. You can also put it in the Q&A forum. And I'll just throw out some things that I want to achieve. I'd like to come out of this discussion today with maybe 2 to 3 ideas of projects that we would take forward. I'll throw out one that was almost a panel discussion, but it's an example of one, and that is making open water data more accessible to our communities that are most vulnerable. And that might mean taking some of our high value data sets and turning them into Spanish speaking only language accessibility products. And so, for example, we could change the name of the data resource, maybe make it more discoverable that way. We could also go a deeper level and change the data elements into some sort of Spanish speaking data structure that would map out to the original one. And that again would make it more accessible and useful to some of our communities. So that's an example idea. Another example idea that we've come up with is what we're doing actually is building off of the Pollution and Prejudice team's amazing work. We have started a project with OpenScapes, which is a NC's product that is really aimed at establishing common foundational frameworks for doing open science and open research together. This allows us to sort of get it right from the start. When we establish some of our pre-planning objectives, we don't surprise communities with, hey, we've got a new team of researchers that's going to come helicopter in and et cetera, right? So this is, OpenScapes is a really cool idea that we can all participate in. And that gives us a foundation upon which we do additional research in the space. Pollution and prejudice is unlimited in many ways in terms of where it can go. We only looked at redlining, but there's all these redlining influenced areas that someone could help us think about. Like redlining was something that happened in the 30s, 40s, and 50s at the latest, but the actual impacts and influence of those redlining efforts continued on until today, really. When I moved into my house in River Park, East Sacramento here in 2005, there was covenants in place that they weren't enforceable, but they were still there. And you look around the neighborhood and it's clear that they're still kind of working in a way. So these kinds of things live on in legacies. This was not a red line neighborhood. It didn't even exist until the late 50s. So lots of space to go in terms of expanding out that geographic scope and footprint of the research, as well as potentially going deeper into some specific areas. We've also talked about and explored places like Stockton. There's lots of energy and research being done and going deeper into some of these spaces. So that's an idea that's been thrown out. So I'll kind of pause and see what my panelists think.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great, Greg. I was thinking a little bit of one part of the story map was really talking about how this racism through redlining went from explicit to implicit. I think in the 1960s or the 1950s or 60s, and so it's important to think about how that continues to persist and how to characterize that and do work around that. The data set we have is really only for 6 cities in California, and you can and so how do we characterize areas in California that were I'm sorry, I'm getting it unstable, but if you could still hear me, how do we characterize these areas in California that these communities were victims of housing-based segregation that may not necessarily be present in those original redlining data sets, so that we can do a better job. Interesting.
Thank you, Walker. Yeah, you cut out a little bit, but I think we all got the gist of it, and it was very complimentary to what we were hearing from your presentations, you and Jamie talking about. So that's definitely an area and a space that we can do is how do we make anti-racist analyses of these data sets be more expansive and not just be limited to redlining, intersecting with the data sets that we have most available. And so this is something that we've talked about at the Water Board too. This is also like an opportunity, I think, I guess I'm gonna just ask Tara and others, what do you think about accessibility of our data sets? Is that an issue in the audience? Do you think that we're currently making our data accessible to people that most need it?
I think before we move on, I think one point that we should at least state is that moving towards racial equity, successfully achieving racial equity where race cannot predict horrible outcomes, that can't be done by special projects. Right? So it's going to take more. All these projects are great, and we should totally do them. I'm all for it. But as Lydia mentioned, Dr. Jennings mentioned in her talk, as our keynote, Ebony mentioned in her talk, it takes everyone to change these systems, and that's what it is. It's institutional and systemic. So doing a special project or having a certain individual that's, in charge for coordinating with all the tribes or doing all of the community outreach as a single person or even a team, that's not enough. And so we kind of need to reframe ourselves and our own lenses so that we think about this intentionally in the work that we're already doing. And I just want, before we dive in on projects, I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you. No, that's a very good point. It was in the talking notes as well. So I encourage people to kind of read through this document if they haven't looked at it yet. There's a lot of other good things. I also, I feel a sense of well, not urgency, but we have people's attention. We have over 100 people probably participating right now. So let's think collectively, let's think intentionally, and let's maybe try to set some goals to come back next year. And thank you. Okay, so are there any other like large framing thoughts that we want to make sure?
Yeah, I think it's really important to be constantly reframing who is asking the questions. So, Greg, you asked in your one of your questions after my presentation was, how can we support tribal nations and rethink swamp? And I think partially it's looking at what our specific communities prioritize as important to them versus what our federal and state agencies prioritizing. And one of the complaints or one of the feedback that we often get is that there are large databases assessments on sites that aren't a priority to specific tribal nations. And so really having them frame the questions about what is important to their own provenance is going to be really critical to thinking on how we make this more equitable. The other part I just want to tag on to what Anna said is that it's great if we have an Indigenous person on a water board, but it also just can't be one voice, right? How are we making space for historically excluded communities? And sometimes that's going to mean, which is really uncomfortable for a lot of us, but giving up a seat at that table, right? Asking how they can be present, how you can support them. It also is going to mean that in some of our communities, we have members who didn't go and get a PhD, but instead really embedded in training themselves in traditional knowledge experts. And so how are we elevating those perspectives and voices in how we ask questions? I think those are important criteria to think about how we can braid together those knowledge systems.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, I think about that a lot. The swamp program, when I came on board, was already partnering with many of the tribes, especially the Klamath based tribes and the Clear Lake based tribes on harmful algal bloom and the data sets. And we heard loud and clear a number of things. One, there was too much of this impact happening, and there was a lack of understanding of their cultural practices that were able for them to be able to even converse with the impacts and the issues. And then we heard also their concerns about the data, and they often get grants from either US EPA or the state, and then they have a requirement to put their data into a database. They couldn't even effectively get their data into a database. And they still struggle with that. And it wasn't ever sort of reframed, as you discussed, Dr. Jennings, about, this is actually your data. What do we need to do to empower you to use your data more effectively? Not so much a control process on, please put it here and put it here this way, and we won't pay you until you get it. So we're still struggling to come to a better place with that. And that's a very self-reflective thing that our swamp and our harmful algal bloom team is thinking about all the time. But it takes a while to redo these structures, and the infrastructure that we have in place to engage around water data alone, let alone water data for vulnerable communities, is not built. And this is actually one of my pet peeves, and I don't think it's suitable for a project because it's just so huge. But when people talk about water infrastructure, they don't think about the water data component and how important that is. And so water data infrastructure is infrastructure. And increasing our advocacy platform for, and this goes to tribes and small communities, the people that already have infrastructure aren't complaining about lack of water data infrastructure. MWD and other places like that have lots of oodles of money to build the data sets that they need and use them the way they want. But the people with the least access to that kind of power are struggling. So are there any thoughts that collectively we have about enhancing or changing that mindset or framing it differently? Tara, I know, Anna, go ahead, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think just before we undertake changing those systems, acknowledging that sort of change is going to be uncomfortable, as we've talked about potentially. It's going to mean some people lose control of some things, different people gain different control of some things. It's going to mean that we need to shift the way we allocate our resources and money and funding. And I think we just need to get sort of as a community, acknowledge that, prepare for that, and know that that's okay. because we're going towards better systems and better change. But, you know, a lot of folks might be uncomfortable, and just also acknowledging that the SWAM programs are non-regulatory. So it's much easier for me to say we're going to realign something because we aren't necessarily regulators, we're data producers, data generators. But kind of getting everyone comfortable with and normalizing that sort of discomfort and learning how to work through it together with our partnerships is going to be critical for building the new data infrastructures and the new institutions that support racial equity in all its forms.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Tara.
Okay. Yeah, just I know that we're closing in on time, and Greg, you had sort of helped to map out a little bit of a roadmap or think about some next steps. So I know one of the things that we had talked about sort of leading into this panel is this idea of having sort of an ongoing venue for discussions. I mean, this is obviously a fantastic venue, and we have a really captive audience, and we would love to think about how to continue this discussion, both the discussion, but then you know, tee up outcomes and projects moving forward. And so, you know, we talked a little bit about whether the consortium would be the right venue to be hosting that. And so happy to talk a little bit more about that. And then what some of the outcomes from that might be. I can see that as sort of a valuable opportunity to bring people together, maybe set some collective goals, but also then take existing projects, whether it's existing or emerging projects, and really come together as a group to say, you know, how do we flip some of these dynamics? What elements have we maybe not thought about, and challenge one another in our thinking around those? And then also think about, I think when we're funding projects, are there ways that we can flip the dynamics around this and take the power from, maybe it's taking the power from the consortium or the state board, and really giving that to communities to say, you let us know what it is you need, and we're going to support you in that. And just, you know, I think, again, it goes back to this idea that there are so many ingrained and institutional structures that wherever possible, if we can think about ways to challenge that, those dynamics, and jointly just continue to learn from and push one another, I think that would be fantastic. So happy to talk more about some of that as well, if that would be helpful.
That's lovely off ramp that you're providing there. Thank you. Walker, did you want to add to the conversation?
Sure. I think about the dynamic around data requests often, and requests for analysis often. And you know, there are pitfalls associated with being fulfilling some sort of request that comes in. You know, one of the ones is that you might not be doing what the person asked for originally. As a government data steward or a data provider or some analysis provider or something like that. You also might hit some sort of red tape or roadblock within this government structure, and essentially are not responsive to the person who originally wanted some work done in the first place. So what I'm hoping that we can get to and move towards over time is just changing that, where you're working more collaboratively with the person and empowering the person to use the data, whether it be you know, making sure they get it, making sure they understand it, making sure they understand caveats behind it, where you're really working together with them on it, and asking them, you know, what can we be doing in terms of analysis and providing information, rather than being reactionary, I guess. And so that's an interest that we're trying to work together and trying to focus on around Cal Enviroscreen. And I would think that sort of thing applies to other sorts of requests or questions about data, framing it as being collaborative and working together, and less about responding to a request and putting it in a docket or something like that, and just sort of shifting one's perspective on that.
That's great, Walker. Thank you. Anyone else? Jamie?
Sorry, I did have a quick comment. So as I'm looking through kind of some of the ideas that people are posting on the project ideas area, a lot of these are external facing projects, which is great, but I kind of wanted to tack on to what Anna and Dr. Jennings were saying, like in order to achieve these wholeheartedly, we have to have an agency within all of these organizations. We have to be representative of like these larger goals of achieving racial equity. So I don't know what departments or organizations are a part of this symposium today, but it'd be great to understand who works in these departments, who are the people that are framing these questions and gathering this data, because maybe we need different people. And I understand that's a difficult conversation to have, but that's a good starting point.
That's an excellent point, and a good way to synthesize the other points that were excellent also. So I think one idea would be to request within either the documentation that we're using right now or the question and answer, people to self-identify if they're from another state agency. And then we could reach out and brainstorm about this idea of what kinds of internal work do we need to do, and where can we start with doing that. We often have cross-agency connections of topics, like on drought right now. Everyone is talking at the top, right, on a daily basis, maybe more often than that, but they're not necessarily connected around a thread like this, and they're maybe not connecting with people within their organization that can empower them even more. So other ideas? I feel like I'm talking too much.
I think just adding to your comment, Greg, about how we already have lots of cross-agency collaborations and systems set up. Sometimes those exclude tribes, and we need to include tribal governments into the same intra-agency conversations that we're having for all of the reasons that Dr. Jennings mentioned before, but kind of just breaking old habits of reaching out to those same folks that we always reach out to, and which is hard. It's really hard, but it's our responsibility to do that as public servants, in my opinion. And so we need to kind of incorporate new workflows and systems so that we are intentional in reaching out to tribal governments, community groups, in the early stages of whatever we're doing, not at the last minute, right before the public comment period, right? So we need to really think long-term and pull folks in early.
Yeah, I just want to add on. I think that's such an important point, Anna, is the timeliness of things. So, my PhD was in mining issues and going through the environmental impact assessments and statements of those. And what we see with tribal consultation is it is a process of more of notification than true consultation. And you even see some tribes or some states moving towards a process of consent moving forward on projects. And I think that makes a lot of agencies and companies really concerned, but it is, if we're going to do something that is in a respectful manner, we have to have a consent or collaborative consent building process. And that's not currently in the framework because, as I mentioned on some of those historical policies, tribes at one point were seen as not able or intelligent enough to make decisions about their own communities that they've been stewarding since time immemorial. So the reason why I bring all of this up is it takes time to build up this process, and that is, it needs to be a process of building trust, which means contact very early on. And an issue that many of the communities that we work with often express is that we are invited to be part of grants at the very last minute, a week before, when many tribal communities have 1 or 2 people in their environmental departments. So that's not sufficient. But 2, it doesn't really give us enough of a timeline or a framework to really evaluate what the questions are that are being asked, how that aligns with our communities, and reach out to our tribal community experts in those areas. So I think time and time again, it's going to come back to this process of relationship building. And also, how are these projects benefiting a tribal community, or are you being intellectually extractive? Those are questions any researcher wanting to work with a tribal nation really needs to ask themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the apparatus that we use to do diplomacy from state to tribes is large, from my experience. And I think one infrastructures that would build on to what that interest is that you, Anna, and Dr. Jennings just talked about would be to, go back to that question I asked in the presentation of what can the state board do now? And one idea that comes to mind is to build on our resolution that we have about open data. Is we could make one about fair and care data for Indigenous communities being sort of like a priority area that we establish some infrastructure pieces. I know that doesn't solve the problem alone, but that establishes a path. Love to work on
your audio is breaking up, Greg.
Okay, I thought that was just me, so I didn't say anything.
No, he's a little bit frozen.
Yeah, and I think Greg was talking about embedding the fair and care principles as they pertain to tribal nations.
It actually kicked me out of my other machine, so I'm just going to go with audio for a while.
No, thanks, Greg. I think that was a great point, and I was just adding that, part of what I was thinking about as Dr. Jennings was talking is that, I loved the framing, and it was such a fantastic overview of her work and how to engage with tribal nations and data sovereignty and the like. But part of this comes down to how we need to engage even with underrepresented communities as a whole, and embedding those fair and care principles in really how we relate with everyone as it pertains to data, but particularly with underrepresented communities and tribal nations as well. And so thinking about those principles more broadly even.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm thinking about this international spectrum of public participation. I'm sure everyone's seen it. It goes from inform to empower and everything in between. And you can frame that in regards to communities that you're working with, data projects that you're on, entire programs that you're on. So I'm thinking about, in terms of, I know we're close to being done here, but what's to come next year, some sort of case study or evaluation where groups could look introspectively and start to get a sense of where are we, like how good of a job are we doing around data and public participation at these various levels, I think would be an interesting viewpoint as well. Thanks.
All right, I'm hanging on by a Wi-Fi thread here, so if you guys can finish without me, that'd be great.
Greg, I think you need to turn off one of your computers. It's echoing.
I think another kind of project that is something that's more internal that agencies could potentially work on too.
Yeah,
and this
I was
is going
trying to say, I had two machines running. So anyway, I had a major collapse of my broadband. So go ahead and finish.
Okay, thanks, Greg. But one of the things that agencies can work on is, the lessons that I'm learning through the realignment project and being able to compensate tribes and community groups for their expertise. Really, that's what we're doing. Is really challenging. I don't know why. There's a lot of contracting things that happen behind the scenes that are way above my pay grade, but it seems like that is an area that we could work on as agencies to improve, so that as we bring community members and tribal experts to the table in substantial ways, that it doesn't perpetuate that extractive behavior, and that people are compensated and acknowledged for their time and energy and expertise. Again, long-term project, it's not going to happen in the next year, but I just wanted to kind of elevate that and document it before we move forward. And we have, I'm going to kind of take over for Greg here, since so far my audio is okay, but if each of the rest of the panelists, if you kind of have a closing thought that you want to leave us with let's kind of do round robin on that. And then just for those attendees and folks that are going to be watching this after the video is posted, I will include a link to this document so that people can continue engaging and adding thoughts in the interim before we build a process with the consortium and how to more formally engage over the long term. So I'm gonna just popcorn. Walker, do you have any thoughts you want to close out with?
I think the only thing I would say additionally is that government employees who have this responsibility for maintaining, helping people visualize and access data really need to always be doing it through this lens of humility and transparency. And it's something that we are never perfect at, and we really need to always be thinking about working with the community to do better than we did yesterday. Thanks.
Dr. Jennings, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think to kind of add on to some of the points Walker made is not working with community, working for community, right? That's often how we look, is how is our science serving our constituents, our community members, our taxpayers, and also how are we communicating in a way that's accessible to so many of us. And so I'm not really sure how the California Water Board has science communication, but I often think that that begins with our younger generations always, but guided by the expertise of our elder generations. And so moving forward, I just love to see that intergenerational knowledge transfer that can happen. And also, I just want to really add that I'm very optimistic in the conversations here. You never know how some of these conversations can be, and it can make people really defensive. But I'm, like Tara, for example, talking about implementing fair and care principles for all communities that we engage with, I think makes me really excited and optimistic. So thank you all for organizing this and for the many panelists that I learned from today. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Jennings. Tara, do you have any thoughts?
Sure, just a huge thank you to all of you. You've all pushed my thinking a lot, so just want to say thank you for that. And then I think a couple of things that resonated for me is one, this idea that Dr. Jennings talked about, that the data is really viewed in tribal communities as being held by the collective, and that it's really used to enhance and support the collective good. And so I think thinking about that as we enter into these conversations will be really important for all of us to think about who are we doing this for? What is the motivation behind us and behind that? And how do we ensure that we are actually using that data to enhance the collective good? And so, I think Anna mentioned that we'll be continuing conversations about how we want to continue a venue to continue this dialogue moving forward. And so we'll be in touch with people on, what that will look like moving forward and how they can continue to be part of it if they would like. So thank you all.
Great, thanks, Tara. Jamie, any thoughts?
It's always the hardest being the last one. Absolutely echo everything previous panelists have said already, and thank you for inviting me to this conversation. One closing thought I had in mind was I always think back to our race forward training, and the principles of achieving racial equity is normalizing, organizing, and operationalize. And this is just a great venue to start the cyclical style cycle, not just linear, of normalizing and organizing. I see a lot of organizing going on right now in that Google Doc, and I'm just excited to see how we operationalize it. So thank you all.
Thanks, Jamie. Great point. Yeah, operationalizing, that's where we need to get to, right? We're at the very, these conversations are so critical and important and wonderful, but it's really the very early stages. And so there's a lot more work to do. I am going to share my screen, and we just have a couple of reminders for folks. as we close out the second, or if you attended the tribal PIA screening on the 28th, third day of this awesome event. And just want to check, can I get a thumbs up to make sure you guys can see my screen? Okay, great, thanks. So we've kind of referred to this throughout the last 2 days, the Bay Delta Data Sandbox Workshop. It's a tongue twister, say it 3 times fast, I dare ya. If you're into getting into the data weeds and wanna explore some USGS data in the Bay Delta, these are your people. There's still time to register. There's a bit.ly link there. You can also go to the Science Symposium homepage, and it's the 4th registration link. That hopefully attendees, you all have been chowing down and eating your lunch as we have this conversation, but if not, you'll have time to grab a bite and then join at 1:30. And then during the CalSFS session, we mentioned the California Aquatic Bioassessment Work Group meeting, or CABW, that is jointly held with the California Society for Freshwater Science. I mean, mouthfuls, you guys, this is so much. I'll add some more links to the chat, but save the date. It's potentially going to be in person, you know, COVID safety permitting. Safety is our top priority, of course. But October 12th and 13th, there's a bit.ly link here at the bottom for just general information. And just to note that if you want to be a speaker, you've been inspired and you want to share your work with the CABW community.
Recording stopped.
The presentations can be...
Recording in progress.
You can submit your presentation abstract to the presenter form by July 9th. There might be some wiggle room, so just reach out if you have questions or thoughts. And then if you just want to join in the fun and learn from the presenters, you can register by October 1st at the registration link. And also reminding folks, as Angela DePalmadale mentioned, there's going to be a workshop that will include a panel of speakers discussing their tribal ecological knowledge and how we can incorporate cultural data, knowledge, and experience into current and future freshwater research in California. And if you have any questions about that, you can contact the Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program, another acronym for alphabet soup here, at SWAMP, SWAMP, at waterboards.ca.gov, and we can help direct you to whatever you need. And then finally, just want to acknowledge that we regularly partner with the California Water Data Challenge team, and they, this year's been a tough year for hosting our regular in-person events. And just on behalf of that team, want to thank those folks that have been submitting data projects over the past year and have been working diligently, remotely to, you know, put their data hats on and teach us new things. And we won't be having any, you know, in-person gatherings in the short term, but there will be many virtual gatherings coming up through this summer to announce prize winners and celebrate the projects that have been submitted. So check out waterdata.data.ca.gov to sign up for the email list so you can keep tabs. And then last plug is if some or all of the things that you've heard over the past 3 days are interesting to you and you want to stay informed on the things that we're doing, events that are happening, resources that might be available, I highly recommend you sign up for our college, the Water Board's College of Water Informatics email list, or COE as we like to call ourselves. Anyone can join, it's open to the public. We're not going to spam you, but it's a great resource for folks that are any data science journey, and you know, staying and being part of that community will keep you informed for whatever the next steps after these discussions might be. And thank you so much to our panelists that are still here with us, the presenters over the past couple days, and those attendees. There have been over 100 people kind of tuned in at minimum every day, listening and learning and enjoying these talks and presentations and panelists and conversations. So as part of the Science Symposium Organizing Committee, I just want to express my deep gratitude for everyone that has been a part of and contributed to this event this year. And we so look forward to the years ahead. So thanks and have a great afternoon.